So we're talking about property taxes. Ad valorem means at value. You're paying taxes based on the value of your property. When we calculate the taxes, that's going to require a tax rate. That tax rate is decided every year. It may not change from year to year, but if it is going to change, that would happen in July. They would tell everybody, here's the new tax rate. There's a couple of different ways that tax rate might show up, and we'll talk about both of them. The legislation that was passed by the government of North Carolina, which regulates this system of property taxation, is called the Machinery Act. And you might remember it by thinking it's the machinery of the taxation process. The wheels are turning, right? And so property gets taxed based on the value, and then those taxes are used to pay for various things that taxes go for. So the Machinery Act is the thing that dictates the due date when the taxes are due every year. And we're specifically talking about real estate property taxes here, not income tax, not North Carolina revenue tax, not car tax, obviously. This is all about property tax. And so we're going to learn what the dates are attached to this Taxation Machinery Act process. But you do need to be aware of these three terms in particular. Ad valorem means market value. You're taxed based on the market value of the property. The assessed value, that's what you're actually taxed on. The market value is what it's going to start with. But the thing is, every 8 years is when they reappraise your property for tax purposes. It's not every year. It's every 8 years. It would be a huge undertaking to do this every year. So the legal requirement is that the government reassesses every property every 8 years. Because over those 8 years, people have moved in. More and more people have come along and needed to be put burdens on the roads, more and more kids in the schools, all the things that taxes go for. And so there's a need to reassess all of the properties at least every 8 years. That's the requirement. It doesn't mean that they send out an appraiser one by one to each individual property and walk through it and take pictures. It's not nearly that exhaustive. They base it on the market data, things that have sold and what they know about the market, and they basically raise the taxes, raise the tax value, I should say. So if your property tax value is $250,000, and then that next year is the year of octennial reappraisal, that means 8 years before, previously that was the last time they set the tax value. Then next year when they do it again, they might bump it up to $300 or $325. Now your taxes are going to be based on that higher tax value. And essentially it's whatever your tax value is multiplied by the rate, the tax rate, which we'll learn about in a moment. So another testable thing, these two slides are full of testable words. Octennial reappraisal means tax values for properties are reappraised every 8 years. Like octagon, right? Or octagon is 8 sides, so octennial means 8 years. It's required. Got to happen. I live in Cabarrus County, just to the east of Mecklenburg County, where Charlotte is. And I believe, I forgot which, I think Charlotte's, in Mecklenburg County, the octennial reappraisal is 1 year before the Cabarrus one. It just so happens. So I remember just a few years ago, it was only like 3 years ago, I think, Mecklenburg residents got their letters from the government, said, hey, we've reappraised, we've reset your tax value, and everybody was ticked off because they had raised significantly. And their taxes went up quite a bit. But it was because so many people had moved in. So many sales had happened. Also the values had just skyrocketed. That was the main thing. The sales comparable values had gone through the roof. So everybody was paying more in taxes. Now, when they first give you that notice, I believe it's around January or February, And you do have some limited amount of time that you can dispute it. You can say, I disagree. I don't think it's really worth that now. I think you're crazy, and here's my proof. And so we as brokers, when you're a broker, that could be a reason for you to reach out to the people you know. You could say, hey, we just had the octennial reappraisal. If you're upset about your new valuation, I'd be glad to do you a favor and send you some comparable things that have sold that you could use as maybe ammunition to present to the government and say why you don't think your value should be raised as much as it was. Just a way that we can reach out to people. And they might even reach out to you. Hey, you have access to the multiple listing service. They might say, could you send me some comps for my house? Could you send me some things that have sold that are like my house recently that I could use as a justification for asking the government to not reappraise my house quite so high? So octennial reappraisal every 8 years required. But as an optional adjustment, you could do, the government could make a uniform adjustment every 4th year, split the difference. And that's called a horizontal adjustment. They don't have to, but they reserve the right to. As part of the Machinery Act, it's built in. So they might. It might be because things have grown so quickly, appreciated so fast, people moving in, appreciation going so steeply that they choose to do so. Again, the point is to help support the need for all the people that are now living there. The tax rate itself. Remember, the amount of taxes you owe every year on your property is determined by multiplying your tax value, or your assessed value, another word for it, times the tax rate. So how do we know what the rate is? That rate could be adjusted every year. It may not be, but they could. They could choose to. So in any given county, there are various cities. In Cabarrus County, there's Concord, Harrisburg, Kannapolis, Midland, Mount Pleasant. That's about it. There might be one more I'm missing. In Mecklenburg, there's Charlotte, of course, Huntersville, Pineville, Cornelius. So pretend the white shape there is Mecklenburg County. The green shape there is Huntersville. If you live in the county, but not the city, you're only going to have to pay the county tax rate. But if you live in the city, you're going to have to pay both the city rate and the county rate. You with me? So if the county rate is, let's say, 85 cents per $100 of assessed value, which will make sense in a minute, and the city rate is 60 cents per $100, but you're just in the county limits, not the city, you're only going to have to pay on the 85-cent rate. You don't have to pay both. You do have to pay both if you're within the city limits, because that city is located in the county. You can't be in the city without also being in the county, right? However, you could be in the county without being in the city. If that doesn't make sense, let me know. It sounded like it might not make sense to myself. So that'll make more sense when we start adding up some numbers. So here's some dates to know as part of this Machinery Act. When could the government set the new tax rate if they wanted to? If they chose to, that's going to happen in July. They're going to tell everybody the new rate is this. That happens in July. On September 1st is when you're able to pay the taxes for the current year. You can't pay them any sooner. Any of you who might be the kind of bill payer that has to pay it the minute it's due, like my wife, would be frustrated because you can't do it in January. You got to wait till September for the current year. I, however, don't pay them when they're due at first. I push it to the last possible minute. So while they start being payable as of September 1st, there's no penalty and nothing wrong with waiting until December 31st. Even as late as that. I probably wouldn't wait that late, but you can. It's not like late, not considered late. So you could pay those taxes for your property anytime from September 1st all the way to December 31st. And really, when you make a mortgage payment and you have it set up so that your mortgage company makes the tax payment for you, they usually pay it in November and December. So it doesn't matter. Since the taxes are able to be paid as of September 1st, they tend to send out the bills in August, just so you're ready, just so you know. Here's your bill. Get ready to pay the taxes if you want to as soon as September 1st. If you don't pay them by December 31st, then a tax lien will be filed against your property. Remember that from last night? The property tax lien is which position in the tax lien hierarchy? There's number 1. Thank you, Joseph. I saw that. So yeah, property tax, that's when it happens. Now that property tax lien is on the property. January 5th is your deadline to pay the past due taxes without significant penalties, etc. Right? But once you go past January 5th, now you're going to start racking up penalties. As of January 31st, if you haven't paid last year's taxes, now you're going to be famous. They're going to publish it in the newspaper. So-and-so's taxes are late of this property. So it's part of the process. So that timetable is important to know about. Here's another way to see it. The green means all is good. The red means talking about the previous year. So again, July is when the new tax rate is set for this year. August is when the bills get mailed. September 1st and beyond through the rest of the year is when the taxes can be paid. But then you get past the 31st of that same year into January 1st of the next year, because you didn't pay last year's taxes, a tax lien is put against your property. What happens with the property tax lien? Eventually, if you go long enough without paying off the lien, it could result in you losing the property. They could foreclose. So January 1st is when it attaches. January 5th is the last day to pay it without a late penalty. Good question. Are taxes paid before or after the year? They're paid in the same year as when they're levied. So like 2023's taxes, you couldn't make a payment. You can't pay them until September 1st of 2023. And that's what it's covering, the year of 2023. So we'd be talking about this. If we applied this year to this slide, then 2023's taxes aren't going to be late until January 1st, right, of next year, 2024. January 5th of 2024 is the last day to pay 23's taxes without a late penalty. And then January 31st of 2024 is when the fact that you didn't pay 23's taxes is going to be published in the paper. Insurance, let's see. That might depend. I think that might be pay. You could choose to have it in payments. I pay mine every month. They split it up for me. So you could set it up in different ways as far as your homeowner's insurance. If you are if you're including it in your house payment, then it's going to be a little piece. 1/12 of your annual premium will be added to your house payment, so that your lender collects those 1/12 pieces throughout every month. And then once the bill is due, they send it in. But since I don't pay mine with my house payment, I just pay it by itself. And I've set it up with my insurance provider to just pay it monthly as a smaller chunk instead of a big one. So note there in the red, hopefully you can read it. If the previous year's taxes are not paid by December 31st, it's possible that a property could have 2 current tax liens on January 1st through 5th. You've got to pay your taxes, and you'd have a lien from last year being due, but also a lien because this year you got to pay them too, but you can't pay this year's until the upcoming September 1st. And there it is, another reference to the fact that taxes are high priority, number 1 priority. Let's see, in the chat, how often is property tax added automatically to escrow? The lender would love to do it every time. I don't know what the stat is for it, but they would rather do it than not. Because, as we'll see when we get to the finance chapter, they are very interested in keeping your property in proper shape and unforeclosed. Because, as you remember, the mortgage company is in the specific lien bucket, right? That bucket of specific liens. They're higher than the IRS and the other general liens, but they're still not as high as the property tax. So that's a perfect segue. Thanks for asking that question. Perfect timing. The real property tax and not paying it could result in foreclosure, which would be a problem for that mortgage company because they have your property as collateral for the loan that you took out. Therefore, that's why they want to be so nice as to pay it for you. They want to make sure it gets paid. And the other thing they want to make sure is that your insurance coverage doesn't lapse, because they want to make sure their collateral for that loan is also well protected and covered in case it burns down, blows up, something like that, right? That's why they want to do what's called a PITI payment. Anybody ever heard of a PITI payment, PITI? Let's see, there we go. When you make a house payment, it's called PITI, stands for principal. That's the amount that you owe, the loan amount. Interest, the amount that you pay the lender for the privilege of borrowing the money. Taxes, and this is a monthly payment we're talking about here. This monthly PITI. So it's going to be 1/12 of the year's worth of taxes in every monthly payment, and insurance, 1/12 of the year's worth of insurance in every payment. But sometimes if you choose, you could tell the lender, you know what, I'll handle the taxes myself. I don't want you to do it. And I'll handle the insurance myself. All I'm going to send the lender is P&I, principal and interest. I'm going to buy down or pay down the amount that I owe, the loan amount, that goes toward the principal of the loan. And then I'm going to pay the fee for borrowing it, which is called interest. But we'll get into that in a future chapter. Tell me if I go too fast. I'm kind of revved up at the moment, but I'm happy to pace myself a little better. Okay, good. I still have this set to private chat, so you can, whatever questions you send me are just going to be seen by me. Thank you, Joseph. I saw that now. So that property tax is the number one lien position. If you get in trouble, you got a bunch of liens on the property, that's what gets paid first. Second position, if it's applicable, is the special assessments. Third is the bucket of liens that are specific to the home. That includes the mortgage, mechanics liens for workers that did work. Could be, what else? I just blanked. Mortgage, mechanics lien. I totally blanked. I'll think of something later. And then general liens apply to both the property and the person, like the IRS, like the North Carolina Department of Revenue. Okay. With all of that said, let's touch on some math. Do the first little bit of math. I think we might have done one thing so far, but let's look at some calculations. First of all, there are a couple of ways we could think of this. If any of you have math phobia, like I do, I'm pretty good with the real estate at this point, but my tendency is to be a little nervous when it comes to the calculations, and that's normal. Don't worry about it. If I can do it, you can do it. It's going to be fine. But I have this little visual, this little graphical way to think about this stuff. Let's look at it. We go. So you could, if you remember maybe basic algebra, you know in day-to-day life that 2 times 3 equals 6. If you multiply those two things. And if you were to just see this statement, 2 times what equals 6, your brain would probably naturally think 3. Not a problem, because you're an adult and you buy things at the store. And this is just sort of, you're not thinking of it as algebra, but that's really what it is, right? So another way to write this that could be visual would be the 2 times the 3 on the bottom, put that on the bottom of this T formula, and then the 6 on top. Why bother? Why do such a thing? Well, those of you who aren't struggling with math might think this is ridiculous and you're going to do this every time. That's fine. You do your thing. And that works for you. Pick your favorite way, stick with it. But the reason this little circle formula or T formula might work better is because the thing on the top, if you remember what goes on the top for that particular type of calculation, you can divide it by either one of the things on the bottom to equal the other thing on the bottom. And if you know these 2 things, but not this thing, then if you just multiply those together, you're going to get the thing on the top. So that's kind of how this T formula thing works. And I'll tell you, with every math calculation that we learn, I'll give you a T formula to go along with it. And I think you'll start seeing that'll take out the element of, yeah, but what do I do with it? But so, because most of the math in real estate can be boiled down to 3 things and their relation to each other. X times Y equals Z, or 2 times 3 equals 6, right? So when it comes to taxes, the calculation is going to look like this. If we put it in the form of a T formula, it's going to be the annual tax bill. I call it and tax. I think of it as a lady. And tax there on the top, the tax rate, and the tax value as the thing on the bottom. Oops, sorry. There we go. So to get the annual taxes, you just need to have a rate and multiply it by the tax value of the property. If the problem on the test gives you the tax value of the property and gives you the tax rate at which you are taxed, just multiply them together. If the problem on the test says, okay, yeah, but the annual taxes are $1,300 a year and the tax value is $237,000, okay, you know 2 out of the 3. That's all you need. And now because of this T formula, you know where to put them in relation to each other. And so this thing divided by this thing gives you this thing. Now you can answer that question. What's the rate? Or here's the annual taxes. The bill is $5,300 a year. The tax rate is $1.27 per $100. That'll make more sense in a minute. Divide the annual tax by the tax rate, and that will tell you what your tax value is. So let's apply this to some actual numbers, and I think this will help and make some sense. First of all, there are 2 kinds of rates, 2 ways that the rate could be expressed. Either mill rate, it could be given in number of mills, or it could be given in dollars. Oops, let's do it this way. Dollars per $100 of tax value or assessed value, whichever way you want to say it. Same word, same thing. Assessed value means assessed value for tax purposes. So a mill rate, it's a better way to say it here. A mill rate's going to look like this. 7 mills. The dollar per $100 type of rate is going to look like this. $1.20 per $100 of tax value or assessed value, whichever way you want to say it. So let's take the mill rate first. If the tax value is given in mills, like this one. The assessed value, they're saying the assessed value, also known as the tax value, is $257,000. That's the value of the property on which the taxes will be based. Okay, so $257,000. The tax rate is 14 mills. What is the owner's annual tax bill? All right, we'll just plug it into our little formula, as you can see already. For one thing, we need to convert that number of mills into a decimal. So that's what the step one is talking about. You see in this case 14 mills. You need to turn that into a decimal version of the same thing. And you do that by dividing it by 1,000. And if you look at the little calculator here, let me see if I can, there we go. Nope, stay, right? Nope. I'll do it this way. $14 mills divided by 1,000 gives us a decimal of 0.014. So if I rewrite this a little bit to make it look more like a T formula, here's how I get the decimal that I need in order to do the tax calculation. Okay? So step one, when it's a mill rate, divide by 1,000. If you'll notice, the little thing that actually happened here, the number 14, if you remember maybe from school, that's not just the number 14. That's actually 14 decimal 0, right? Same thing. Any number is an understood 0.0 after that number. 37 is the same thing as 37.0, right? So 14.0 is the same as 14 mills. When we divide that by 1,000, all we do is move this decimal place 3 places to the left to right there, and then put in a 0. Same thing. So you could basically do this in your head. You don't need a calculator to divide something by 1,000 or 100 for that matter. We'll be doing the divide by 100 in a minute. So we've got this. Now we know the decimal we need, 0.014. Now let's do that to get our annual tax bill. Here's what the formula looks like for annual taxes. It's that rate, in this case the mill rate, 0.014, the decimal version of the mill rate, times the assessed value. So let's see what those things were again. 257 was the assessed value. So we'll put that in here, 257. Our decimal version of the mill rate, we already figured out. All we have to do now is multiply those two things together. And so here's our calculator again, times the 257. That reveals that our annual tax bill is $3,598 per year. Annually, right? Annual taxes. Not too bad, huh? That's using the mill rate method. Now let's do the same thing if it's a town, like in North Carolina, in the Charlotte area that I'm in, we don't use this method. We use the other kind of rate. But this mill rate method, I think they use it out toward the middle part of the state, maybe out toward the coast. But let's apply it to a different type of rate. What if instead of 14 mills, the tax rate that the town you're in tells you the rate is $1.40 per $100 of tax value? That could be the other way that you see this rate. And that's okay. No big deal. We need to, just like we did for the mill rate, we need to convert this $1.40 into a decimal that we can work with. In other words, what do you think we're going to do? With the mill rate, we divided that 14 by 1,000. With a dollars per hundred method, what do you think we're going to divide the $1.40 by? It's not 1,000. Yeah, it's like staring at us in the face. It's in the name of the way the rate is spoken, right? So $1.40 per hundred is basically if you plug in $1.40, 1.4, and hit the percent sign. If you have a calculator with a percent sign, and you probably do, all that is when you hit the percent sign is literally dividing that number you put in by 100, which is exactly what we need to do in this particular situation. Another thing you've observed probably is that $1.40, same idea. How many zeros are in 100? 2 of them. When we were doing the mill rate, we had to divide by 1,000. We went over 3 zeros worth of spaces. But now we're going to go over 2 zeros worth of spaces to the left. 1, 2. Boom. And there it is. 0.014 is the decimal version of a rate $1.40 per hundred. Then we just plug it in like we did before. Annual taxes on the top. The rate on the bottom. And the tax value of $257 also on the bottom. And what do you know? It's pretty much the exact same calculation because I secretly gave you the mill rate that was the same equivalent to $1 per hundred, right? So if we take that 257 times the 0.014, there's our same annual taxes that we got on the other one. So the point is, it doesn't matter what the style of rate is, mill versus dollars per hundred. You do the same stuff with it. The only difference is for dollars per hundred, you're going to divide this thing by 100. For mill rate, you're going to divide this number by 1,000. I don't know. How do I remember the difference? I think mills, I think of it like a million. And how many zeros are in a million? 2 sets of 3. Right? So that's 3 zeros. So that's like 1,000. That's just the silly way I remember which is which and what do you do with it. The other way you could remember it is that the dollars per hundred literally tells you what to do with it. Per hundred. Divide by 100. Let's do another one. I'm going to let you do this one. The assessed value is $347. The tax rate is, let's do it this way. Tax rate is 9 mils. What's the annual tax bill? Yes, they do let you have a calculator. It has to be what I call a dumb calculator. It can't be the kind that stores words, right? Obviously, just does numerical functions. So what are we going to do here? Step 1, I just have combined the two, actually. I will write it out like this, and I'll say annual taxes equals rate times assessed value. And then within the rate here, what did I tell you? 9 mils. 9 mils. I'll just divide by 1,000 in that little square down there, which means I'll take that 9 and go 1, 2, 3. So it's 0.009. And I might double check it in the calculator because why not? There it is, 2 zeros, just like we had. Multiply that by the 347 tax value. Just multiplying those two things together. And there it is, everybody. Good job. Looks great. 3,123 per year. We okay there? Not too bad. No, I get it. Don't worry about that, Samantha. Tech problems make it interesting, don't they? So let's do one that's the other way. In this case, the assessed value is $519, and the rate is let's see, 93 cents per $100. What's the annual tax in this situation? You guys are quick. We need to turn that rate into a decimal, a different decimal. We need to get rid of this per 100. So that means we need to take that 93 cents and hit the percent sign. I hesitate to tell you that because I don't want you to accidentally be fatigued and you're in a mill rate problem and you try to hit the percent sign, but it's a mill rate. That's going to mess you up because that doesn't divide by 1,000. I'd rather always say divide that 93 cents by 1,000 or by 100. In this case. So the 0.0093 is the rate. The 519 is the tax value. And that gives us our annual tax bill of $4826.70. There you go. Not terrible. You round to cents. You would round to 2 decimal places. They want their pennies. There is one where you round to the nearest dollar, and that's called excise tax, but that's not this. Someone had asked what you round to. I'm going to switch this over to everybody so you can all see what's in the chat. Now, there is a little bit of element of complexity that could happen in a problem because they might say this. The city tax rate is 47 cents per 100. The county tax rate is 82 cents per 100. The property is located in the city limits. What are the annual taxes? And I guess I should give you a tax value. Assessed value, let's say, is 43. Do we need one of those rates or both of those rates? Why do we need both? You got it. So pay attention to that. Once if they on the test give you a both city and county rate, you're looking out now to see what are they going to say next. Are they going to say the property is located in the city limits? They might be tricky and say the property is located outside the city limits. And they would have given you both. So just because you see both, don't think you add them up every time. You need to read and see what they're telling you. They like to give you that. They will frequently give you more than you need in a question. So you need to know which number you need, if not both, right? In this case, you do need both because it is, as you said, in the city limits. So we're going to add 0.47 with 0.82. And that means the value we're going to use is $1.29 per 100. We can go ahead and do the math. So 0.00129. And while I'm pretty sure about that, I'm still going to plug it in because, oops, see what I did? I did do it wrong. 2. I did by 1,000. That's what I do all the time. So no shame in double checking. So 0.0129 is the thing on the bottom. 443 is the tax value. We'll multiply those together. So our tax bill, as you guys already told me, $57.14.70. So let's look at it on the, let's look at the pretty version. Here's our assessed value. Now you're old pros at this. You know what's up. 14 mils divided by 1,000 gives us the proper decimal that we need, 0.014. Plug that in, multiply it by the assessed value, and that gives us our annual taxes. That's using the mill rate method. This looks like something a little different. Same tax value, but a different rate altogether, just to test you differently. Now we're going to take this $1.27 per 100, divide that by 100, not by 1,000. There's our decimal version. There's our tax value. That gives us a $32.63.90 annual tax bill. We okay there? And then, oh, here's another thing they like to throw at you, a little spin. They'll say the assessed value is a percentage of the market value. So the assessed value is 85% of the market value, and the market value is $574. So how would we figure out what the actual in dollars assessed value is if we know that it's 85% of 574? You got it. There, yeah. We're just taking what 85% is of 574. So our assessed value or tax value is 487.9. So that would be the first step here. So when you see a tax calculation question, your first thought is, what are they giving me? Are they giving me price or market value and then a percentage that is the assessed value? Or do they go ahead and just give me the assessed value and I don't have to do that math? But we've done that step. Now we know our assessed value is 487.9. Here's like a little 3-step system. We take that market value, multiply it by the percentage like Marcus just did to get the assessed value. We plug that in. Down here in step 3, we need to get the mill rate put into decimal version by dividing by 1,000. Then we have that decimal version that we can plug in over here and then multiply those two things together to get the annual taxes. So here we go. Marcus took the 85% of 574 and got 487.9 properly, correctly as a tax value. Then he said 487.9 related to 9 mills. It's mills. Think 1,000. Got to divide by 1,000. That's 0.009. Multiply those two on the bottom together. Tax bill on this, $43.91. We okay there? Good. Not as bad as when you first heard me say the word math. That's the new M word. When I was single, the M word was a different word. Now it's math. Let's see, this one. Assessed value is 75% of the market value. Market value is $4.97. The county rate is 67 cents. The city rate is 17 cents per 100. The house is located outside the city limits. So what's the tax bill? Take that $4.97 market value, multiply by 75% to get the tax value or assessed value, $372,750. Multiply that by the county only, right? Because it's outside the city limits. So we're multiplying that by 67 cents per 100. Decimal version of that, 0.0067 for $24.97 as an annual tax bill. We good? Again, if the city rate is given and the county rate is given, the next question is, where is the property located? If it's located on this green pointer, then all we need is the 67 cents. If it's located on this red pointer, then we need them both. And then recap of these two ways. If we get the mill rate, if they give us that, divided by 1,000. If they give us dollar per 100, divided by 100, before you multiply it by the assessed value. So here's what it looks like in a linear format, if that's your thing. Market value times percent of assessment gives you the assessed value. If it says the market value or the sale price was $387 and the property tax value is 90% of that, you would use that to get the dollar amount of assessed value. And then take that assessed value times the tax rate to get the annual taxes. Sometimes, we haven't gotten there, but there are some cases where we're going to need to figure out the monthly taxes. And in other cases where we're going to need to figure out the daily taxes. And so that's just going to mean find out the annual and then divide by the right number. Remember, in our pre-licensing class and on the test for you guys, we're acting like every month has 30 days. You don't need to worry and try to keep track of February and March versus April, 30 versus 31 versus 28. Every month has 30 days, and since there's 12 months, the year has 360 days. So that's all you need to worry about there. And if it's a daily tax amount that you need to work with for some reason that will make more sense later, we divide that annual tax bill by 360. If our market value is $675, in fact, let me do this. Let me make it not quite so easy. How am I can do that. Let's see. What do I've got close by? Sorry, looking for an image I can work with. I can work with that. Just using this to hide something. There we go. So I'm going to hide the answer and give you guys time to actually figure it out. So the market value is 675. Tax value is 85% of that, and the tax rate is 12 mils. What's the annual tax in dollars? Yeah, that's how I have it set up. That's okay. That's so that people aren't shy about putting things in the chat. So what do? Take that 675 and use it with the 85 to figure out the tax value or assessed value. And then once we get that, multiply it by the, in this case, 12 mils, which is 12 divided by 1,000. All that together in a linear way, not the T formula way. And that gives us our 6885. About this one. Market value 734,500. Tax value 70% of that. 2 rates are given. The property is in the city limits. What's the annual tax in dollars? Think about it this way too, as sort of a way to self-check yourself, the tax value is going to be a lower amount than the market value. And then the annual taxes is going to be the lower amount than the tax value, right? Because in that T formula, the thing on the bottom next to the rate is a bigger number than what you end up with on the top of that T formula. So that might be just a way, if you see something get out of whack, you realize maybe I forgot to divide by 1,000 or divide by 100, something like that. Add those rates together since it's in the city limits. That gives us $1.21 per 100. Get our tax value by multiplying 70% of 734,500. 514,150 times the decimal version of our $1.21 gives us an annual tax bill of $62.21. Does that help? We okay? Seeing lots of nods. That's a good thing. Okay. That's it, guys. That's taxes. We're going to move on after the break. So yes, good point. Is it Kia? What's the proper way for me to pronounce your name? Kaya. Got it. Oh, I got it. Kaya, yes. If they're asking for the city rate, or sorry, if they're saying the property is located in the city limits, then you're going to use both of them together. Because if the property is located in the city limits, in this green area, that's the city. The white area is the county. If it's in the green area, it's also in the county, right? Physically. You can't be in the city without also being in the county. Therefore, you have to pay both rates. So in that case, they gave us two, a city and a county rate, and they told us that the property was located in the city limits. That told us that we needed to add this 23 cents to the 98 cents. Does that help? So just watch out for that. If they give us two rates like this, again, look in the test questions, make sure where the property is located. They might say that it's outside the city limits, even though they're giving us two rates, just to kind of throw a little distraction at you. But you're going to need to use them both if it says that the property is in the city. In no case will you ever only use the city rate, right? You'll never have to just use the city rate because you can't be in the city without also being in the county. You could have to only use the county rate because you could be outside the city limits and therefore not in the city but still be in the county. In this case, have to use the 67 but not the 17 cents. We good? All right, let's go ahead and take a break. I'll see you back here and we'll go on into the next section. Let me see here. Let me take a look. I saw that message, Alyssa. crazy. That's funny. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Okay, good. I'm sorry, Alyssa. I was hoping you'd figure that out. I was trying to figure out if it was like forgot to divide or something. But good. That's just the process. Just got to work your way through it. All right. Now we're in chapter 4. Hearing me okay? Let me get that fixed. Okay, there we go. Chapter 4 is about transferring title. What's that mean? That means selling it, right? Getting rid of it. You could be giving it away. You could be selling it. Getting rid of it, the property. Transferring your title to another person. Selling your car, you assign the title over to the buyer of your car. So with this, we're just signing the title over to the buyer of your property. Another word for title that we'll run into is deed. The deed to your property, same thing as title. There's quite a bit of level 2. I'm working my way through the slides and giving these little battery indicators to show levels 1, 2, or 3. I just haven't gotten them all done. But there's a good bit of level 2 in this particular chapter. And from this chapter, there should be 4 questions on the national portion of the exam. FYI. Do you remember how you can find that out if I don't tell you? What's another way you can find out how many questions are coming from various topics? There you go. Look at you. Good job. Yeah, it's right there. Right here. Yep. I think around page 16 or 17, something like that. Here it is. There we go. So might come in handy. And here we are in 4. Combination actually of transfer of title and also federal income tax, both those together would result in 4 questions on the national, none on the state. So you might have 3 in chapter 4 and then 1 in chapter 18, so whatever that is. Okay. We're going to learn about the different methods, different ways we transfer title, something called essential elements of a deed. What makes the deed a valid deed requires certain essential elements. So we'll learn what those are. We'll learn about different kinds of title or different kinds of deed. And then we'll learn how to calculate excise tax. That's another kind of tax. We just did property tax. And then in this chapter, we're going to learn about basically an excise tax is a sales tax. It's what the seller has to pay for the privilege of selling their house, right? Goes to the government. And as you'll see in a minute, it's actually based on the sales price, not the assessed value like we've been doing in that last chapter. Then we'll talk about this concept of title insurance. When you own a property, title insurance is a smart thing to have to protect your property against other people claiming they own it and other sorts of clouds that might be placed on the property. Maybe your neighbor's fence goes across the line onto your property or vice versa. Your title insurance policy would help resolve such a thing if that came up. This process of transferring your property, another word for that we see is alienation. But it's not this kind of alienation. It's alienating yourself from your property, right? You're separating yourself or selling it or giving it away. Distancing yourself from the property is what alienation is about. When we get to the foreclosure chapter, we'll learn that the mortgage, one of the mortgage provisions that the lender requires that you sign off on is called an alienation clause. That alienation clause says, hey, if you ever sell this property that you have a mortgage on, that we've loaned you money to buy, when you sell it, we're expecting all of our money. Whatever you still owe us as a lender, that loan amount, you better pay us off. That's called the alienation clause. So we'll see this word again. If we're going to sell property to somebody, what do you think is important to have on that deed? What sorts of things, if you had to decide, if you were the decision maker, here's how this is going to work. What are we going to require goes on that deed? What kind of information would you want to see on a deed? I'm going to share this one, everybody, in the chat. Yeah, certainly the buyer's name. Absolutely. What else? Help him out. Okay, that's a good idea. Maybe how much it was bought for. How much what was bought for? You're rolling your eyes. You're like, duh, the property. But how do we know what property? What method are we going to use? What do we need to how do we determine what property it is we're even selling? Yeah. Some sort of way. You might be thinking the address. That's a good one. There's actually certainly the address, no question. But that's actually not even an official legal description. There are 3 ways you can legally describe property, the official description ability. And that's the exact description of real estate. It actually turns out that street address is informal. That's an informal method of identifying property. The legal address is the formal method. And so describing it is an essential element of a deed. We need to make sure that we identify what it is that we're transferring. So yeah, that's one of the essential elements. Good job. We certainly want to know what it is. Where is it? So how do we do this legal description thing? If street address is not a formal legal description method, what is? The best method in North Carolina is this thing called a meets and bounds description. Meets and bounds. The best, most favored method in North Carolina. And we'll see an example of that in a minute. Another good method is to reference a previously recorded map, a survey called a plat map of the property and all the properties around it and where this property fits amongst all those other ones in the neighborhood. So we'll see what that looks like too. So either a reference to a previous recorded map or the meets and bounds description or a reference to another deed on the property from the last time it sold, maybe a prior recorded deed. All 3 of these things are the 3 methods of proper legal description allowed in North Carolina. There are other methods, but we don't do them here. The one big other way property is described is called the Government Rectangular Survey System. And we will need to learn a little bit about it in this class, but it'll show up on the national portion of the exam, not the state portion, because we do not, write this one down, we do not do the Government Rectangular Survey method in North Carolina. It's done sort of more in the Midwest and the rest of the country, but not the East Coast and Texas. Those are all meets and bounds. So let's dig into this meets and bounds method first. Since that's the premier, best possible method, that we prefer. And it comes all the way from 200 plus years ago. The original 13 colonies, gosh, that's longer ago than that. The original 13 colonies used the meets and bounds method. So all of those states that were the original along the East Coast pretty much used this same method as their preferred way. And so if you see it on the left, that paragraph, it looks pretty crazy. It's describing, those words on the left are basically describing the picture on the right. And so the meets and bounds description is the paragraph on the left. It's saying if you start at the northeast lot corner, and then they use some old world terms sometimes, thence, whatever the heck that is, south 16 degrees, 42 minutes, 22 seconds east. That's just a direction. When you see that 42, 22, that just means what direction are we going in? And then how far are we going? 100 feet. So we're going 100 feet, south 16 degrees, 42 minutes, 22 seconds is like a subdivision of degrees. You all know what degrees are. Well, what's less than degrees? Minutes and seconds. So south 16 degrees, 42 minutes, 22 seconds, east 100 feet. Thence, then head, in other words, then head south 33 degrees, 1440 west. Then go 145. You see, this could turn into pages and pages. Can you imagine like 3 pages worth of words and numbers like this? That's the meets and bounds description. And then the important part here is not all that nonsense in the middle, but look at the last line. Back to the point of beginning. So there's one of the testable items about the meets and bounds description. You have to end where you started. You have to make a closed shape. Otherwise, it's an incomplete description, because what you're literally doing is writing out a description of that shape on the right. And you see it's a weird shape, but it's a closed shape. It's not like a U, right? It's an enclosed shape. If you put a fence in line with the outline there, you couldn't get into that fence unless there was a gate. It's not like a baseball backstop, an open shape, right? So that point of beginning there at the top of the picture, and then in the description says thence south 16 degrees, and there we go. To the left there, 16 degrees, 42, 22, blah, 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 whatever. And none of that matters except that the point is we get back around to the point of beginning. And that's the official and preferred way to describe property for a legal description in North Carolina. So what do you need to know for this test? When it comes to the meets and bounds description method, it's the preferred way. It shows the boundaries. And then what are some terms associated with it? The terms associated with meets and bounds include point of beginning, point of ending, meets or meters or distance and direction. Right? Meets and bounds just means distance and direction. Another term is monument. What is a monument? It's each of the corners, because in the old days, they would say, start at the rock between 1st Street and 3rd Street and travel 100 feet, thence blah, 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 degrees and this and that, and then turn left at the stream and then turn at the oak tree. Well, oak trees fall down eventually. So the monuments from back in the day were literally like nature landmarks, like rocks and things. Monuments today, when a surveyor surveys a property today and then writes a meets and bounds description, the monument is nothing that you can really see because it's a stake. It's like a metal rod, like a piece of rebar that they drive into the ground that they can locate with a metal detector. That's what's going to outline the monuments, each corner, each place where the direction changes. So that's what we're talking about here. So what words do you need to know that tell you we're talking about meets and bounds? Point of beginning, point of ending, monuments, where the directions change, meets and bounds, or distance and direction. All of those are the terms that we associate with meets and bounds. So there's our point of beginning in the red. There's our monuments where the directions change. And then our distance and direction are the meets and the bounds themselves. So what are terms associated with these meets and bounds or this method? Tell me in the chat. What are those meets and bounds terms? Good one. Point of beginning. You got it. Monuments, meets, bounds, distance, direction, any of that stuff. Yeah, point of ending. Great job. So again, that is the stuff here in white on this map, plus Texas, right? The original 13 colonies plus Texas uses primarily the meets and bounds method. All of the pastel, the colorful part, that uses that other method that we don't do here. That uses what's called the government rectangular survey system to figure out how to lay out property, how to properly legally describe it. It came from the 1700s. I think it was actually Thomas Jefferson was one of the main guys that figured it out, but the government came up with this method. And if you've ever flown in the airplane out west and looked down and seen like perfect grid patterns or seen pictures of that, it's because this stuff is laid out this way. It's laid out like a perfect grid as much as you can around landmarks and the nature stuff. But it was just the way they decided was the best way to establish a property identification method, a systematized way when they were discovering the New West, right? When people were claiming territory out there. And it boils down to this. So all of those government rectangular survey states that do it that way end up putting it in these grids. And so what we have here in purple, if it runs north and south, like if you laid a grid over the map, the north and south lines are called meridians and ranges. That middle main center line is the principal meridian. And then all those ones that go out to the left and right from it in purple are the range lines. So guess what you're going to need to know for the test? What are the terms associated with government rectangular survey? And here they are. You could do a screen cap if you want to. The horizontal lines running east and west. And the names of those are baseline for the center one, that yellow line in the very middle, and then also tier lines going up and down. So we have this grid pattern made out of ranges and tiers and meridians and baselines. And if you'll notice that blue square in the upper right corner, that is actually a township. So if you live in such and such town, that's what it is. It's a township. And so you need to know a couple things about a township. Within any given township, the dimensions of it are a perfect square, 6 miles by 6 miles. A township. So the good test question might be, how big is a township? 6 miles by 6 miles. You could also say 36 square miles, because if you multiply 6 by 6, you get 36, right? And note that that also means that there are 36 sections within a township. A township has 36 sections. If the township itself is 6 miles by 6 miles and it has 36 sections, what are the dimensions do you figure of one section? I know I'm asking a lot for 7 o'clock at night after you worked all day, but here's our blue township, 6 miles long by 6 miles wide, perfect square. And that township is divided up into 36 squares called sections. And if we zoom in on this number 14 section, look to the right, that's the zoom in version. One section of a township is a mile by 1 mile. See the theme emerging here? And then thank goodness you don't need to know any more than that. Look at that section though. If you lived out in one of those states and got a real estate license out there, you'd probably have to learn more in depth, because notice if your house is in this upper right corner of this section within this township, then you would say your house is in the northeast quarter of section 14 of township whatever. But you don't need to worry about that. They took it out of the test for North Carolina. I think it might have been 4 years ago. They used to make you see this long string of northwest quarter by southwest half by blah, 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 and you'd have to figure out where it was. So good for you. Don't have to worry about it. Why would you? That's just dumb, because we don't even do it that way here. So I'm glad they got rid of it. But that's what a section is. And then notice that it says the section, since we know it's 1 mile across by 1 mile deep, they also tell us that it's 640 acres. 640 acres is the yellow part or the orange part here, right? That's the area. And so what does that mean? How do we get that? I'm going to draw a poorly drawn square. Let's pretend that's a perfect square. Anybody happen to know how many feet are in a mile? Why would you? Oh, good job, Zach. 5280. If this is 5280 down here and this is 5280 over here, then how do we figure out what this is? Just multiply them together, right? 5280 times 5280 is a whole bunch of feet, right? It's 27,878,400 square feet. That's that area yellow. Now, thank goodness, we can turn that into acres. Acres. Let me share something else with you. Anybody know how many square feet are in 1 acre? Got an acre of land. How many square feet of land is that in 1 acre? Think of it this way. 4 little old ladies driving 35 miles an hour in a 60 mile an hour zone. 43,560 square feet. That's my favorite way to remember it. Some people remember it by thinking 4 plus 3 is 7 and 5 plus 6 is 11, 7-Eleven, like the convenience store. But I think about the little old ladies. 43,560 square feet in an acre. Write it down. You have to remember that one. Just got to plug it in. You got to just remember it. Brute strength. Well, what we're going to learn is the way we can turn square feet into acres. See if we can, I don't know if you can see that well enough. Square feet into acres is divided by how many square feet are in an acre. And look, we just made a T formula. And we know this square footage is this big number here. And so if we divide it by 43,560, oh, look. One section, which is 1 mile by 1 mile, is 640 acres. And that's how we get that. And part of what you need to know for the test is how to convert square feet to acres back and forth. If they give you acres, how do you turn that into square feet? If they give you square feet, how do you turn that into acres? So that's a section. Let's look back here. Here's our section that's 1 mile by 1 mile. Here it is within the township. So this is section 14 within this township. And every township is laid out the same way. So for every township, you start in the upper right corner, and that's called section 1. and then you go left 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then you bump over and go back the other way 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Bump over and back and forth. Does this remind you of anything in the summertime when you mow the grass? How many of you mow the grass to get done quickly versus to make it look pretty? If you mow it to make it look pretty, you might like go back and forth and backtrack. But if you mow it to get done real fast, you're just going to go down, move over, come back where you came, go over, go back. So this method of laying out this section like this comes from something that you're all going to be completely familiar with. When I say it to you, you're going to be like, oh yeah, of course, that's how I do it too. This is how you plow a field with a mule, right? Don't we all do it that way? I know it's kind of hard to grasp because we don't do that anymore. But you would start in one corner, you'd go down. You're not going to come back the way you came and then bump over and just do this. That's like twice the work. You're going to go down, go across, back where you came, all the way down. So that's how they did it. That's how they came up with this method of numbering a township. Section 1 is always in the upper right. Section 36 is always in the lower right. And since they have that systematic layout method, what they actually did is they decided, look, in every town, we're going to put all the government-related services, including the schoolhouse, in Section 16. That way, when you ride into a new town, maybe you show up in that new town down here around 35, you know that if I just go up and over a little bit, that's where I'll find the courthouse, the jail, right, the schoolhouse. So that's how they went about laying this stuff out. All of these things are sections, all 36 of them. 16 is where they put the government stuff. These are testable things. The township is 6 miles by 6 miles. And so that's composed of 36 sections that are 1 mile by 1 mile. And then don't forget the terms for the government rectangular survey. Ranges and tiers and baseline and meridian and township and section. And one section is 640 acres. So, pop quiz. What are some of the terms in the government rectangular survey method? Tell me in the chat. Great. Good job. You got it. Perfect. Meridians, baselines, sections, townships. Okay, so that is the government rectangular survey method, the one that's not what we do in North Carolina. Let's back up and remember that the one we do is the meets and bounds method, but there were 2 more, right? The meets and bounds method was one of 3. There's also a reference to a recorded plat and a reference to a recorded deed. So let's see what that's about. Here's the deed. Referencing a last recorded deed. Where is this thing living? Where is this deed to be found? You can find it physically in the courthouse, in the Register of Deeds department of the government building in the county where the property is located. So we could all, tomorrow morning when it opens up, probably around 9, drive to our local county, go to the courthouse or whatever government building has the Register of Deeds in it, walk through the doors and say, let me see your deed books. What room do you keep the books at? And they literally have shelves and shelves of books that are filled with whatever people have chosen to record. When we say record, we're not talking about pushing the record button. We're talking about putting it on the public record, paying those workers in the Register of Deeds office to stamp it and throw it in one of those books and give it a book and page number. So how do we know it's a reference to a prior recorded deed? It will say, you can find this deed at book 317 on page 512. And so there's bunches and bunches of books. Thank goodness you don't have to go in person because most municipalities now, of course, scan them and put them online. So you can check the deed in the Register of Deeds at your chosen county. So we could say Cabarrus County Register of Deeds, or ROD for short. Click on it, scroll down, online records search. I'm just kind of showing you how quick it could go. This is poorly laid out and I don't like it. But if I were to put something in here, I'm gambling that there's a Smith in Cabarrus County. I wonder if I'm right. No way that there's a Smith, right? Froze. My goodness. Ruining my example. Do. Oh, wow. Oh, it's because there were so many. Still so many. Okay, tried and failed. I won't belabor the point. I'll have you a deed. I'll show it to you. And there's an example that we just saw. There we go. So, reference to a prior recorded deed. It's going to show up and it looks something like this. And sometimes there's a bunch of blank space in the top of the page there. But it shows, and we'll look at one a little more closely, but it shows the various essential elements. And it's whatever that last deed was from a previous sale of this same property. As long as nothing has changed except the parties' names, you can reference that last recorded deed. Here's a reference to a recorded plat map. Instead of a recorded deed, you could reference this sort of thing. And it just shows the sort of the neighborhood, the area around the property. And in this case, the property being transferred or alienated is lot 15, block E. So block E is this big strip of like 10 properties, and then lot 15 within this block. And that is a reference to a prior or to a recorded plat map. Just shows the boundaries of the lots in a subdivision. And in order for that plat map to be a legal description, allowable, to be an allowable legal description, it must be recorded at the courthouse Register of Deeds. So, recorded plat map is a method of legal description. Reference to a prior recorded deed is a method of legal description, and meets and bounds is a method of legal description. What are some other ways to describe the property that are not officially legal descriptions, but are still descriptions? They're just not the formal kind. There it is. Yeah. The address is one of them. Another one is something called the tax parcel ID number. They're neither one adequate legal description, but if you know them, put them in there. If you're writing up an offer or a contract, put in the address, put in the parcel ID number. That parcel ID number, let's see this. Oh, good. Finally gave me a response. Let's look at it this way. This is the MLS, by the way. So the way I'll usually look up a tax record is just to go into the MLS because they've linked them all. So if we do a search. I always do this neighborhood because I remember it in the moment. Let's pick a big one. And let's look at the tax record. Here we go. The tax record is the property's tax record. The tax record for a given property has a parcel ID number. Looks like this. What is that? 3, 6, 8, about 8 digits. And that's what they mean. But that's not a legal description. Sorry, Marcus. Thanks for telling me. Let me see if I can, it might be a bandwidth problem. And that's the most that I can zoom in on it. But it's just an 8-digit number. And it shows you, it's the reference to what the tax record says for this property. If we keep on looking down, in fact, let me do it this way. Here's what we're seeing that you might be seeing blurry. I'll put it in the chat. It's just that number, like an 8-digit number. And then here, oops. Oh. And then this is the legal description itself, given in this case as a lot. If you look in the chat, lot 20, block 6. And then they reference this other thing, M25 through 194. I don't know. But sometimes there's extra stuff. Depends on the municipality and city. The main thing is the lot and block number. So that's referencing a plat map because they're talking about a lot and a block. If it was referencing a deed book, we'll see that in another part of this thing. Let me see if I can find it. Just another version of a tax display that pulls from the same stuff. And you'll notice maybe down here, the deed book and page number is this. I'll put it in the chat. There. When you see the word deed here, that means the book in which the deed is located. So which book is the deed located? Book number 8258. On page 764. So when you see a deed page or a booking page, that means they're referencing a deed, prior recorded deed. When you see an L20B6, that's a lot and a block. That's a plat map. Don't see a meets and bounds description anywhere, but maybe that prior recorded deed has it. Maybe if you go back far enough in deeds, back far and far, you'll eventually find one. But any of those three is okay. There's some other stuff in here. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but they talk about the amount, the assessed value. They're saying, look, it was assessed in 2022, and the total tax value of this property is $344,600. That is probably not what it's worth to a buyer. That's probably less than what a buyer would be willing to pay for it. Because all the point of this is to calculate taxes on. And in a healthy market, the tax value is usually less than the market value that you actually could sell it for. They do differentiate, though. Out of that $34,600, they split it up and say the land portion tax value is $100,000. The structure improvement portion, improved portion, $244,600. And then they have it spelled out and they show, look, in 2022, the annual taxes were $34.51. In 2021, they were $34.40. In 2020, they were $34.33. You don't have to know all that. I'm just kind of giving you an idea so that you can have it in your mind, maybe remember a little better when I talk about tax records. And they have a little bit of info on the house, not a ton of detail, but like the acreage, the square feet, the year built, how many stories it is it currently on the MLS? What was the measurement of square feet when it was in the MLS? And notice here, this is kind of unusual. The tax record square footage, they show 3241 square feet. The MLS, they show 3150. Usually it's the opposite. Usually the tax record shows smaller than it really is. So that's basically it. So those are informal methods. Street address, tax parcel ID, but they're not legal descriptions. Here's another look at a plat map. It's more than just the lot size. It also shows the flood lines, flood zones, and setback lines. It might show some dotted lines that you're not allowed to build over. You can't go all the way to the edge of your property to build. You have to stay within maybe 5 feet, 10 feet, 20 feet. Those are called setback lines. And then if there's a flood zone, it'll identify that on the survey as well. It will also show any sort of easements and encroachments. Encroachments, remember those? Your neighbor's building goes over your line. It will identify and show that on the drawing, on the survey. So we have this survey. Who does a survey? A surveyor. So therefore, who should someone ask if they have questions about a survey? Someone to interpret the survey. It shouldn't be us. It's tempting because it's a picture and it's like, okay, well, I can get out my little business card and draw a little mark and figure out how far 10 feet is and draw a little outline of where they should put their fence because I want to be helpful. But that would basically be called interpreting the survey. Don't do it, right? Here's the survey. Well, what does this mean? Great question. Let's ask the surveyor. Even if you know, don't answer it because you don't want to be liable for something you're not certified to give an opinion on. So a survey is a legal document. Therefore, as brokers, we shouldn't give advice on this document. Point them in the direction of the surveyor for those questions or the attorney. Here's a close-up of what the deed looks like. It's got it's evidence of title to the real property. It represents that bundle of legal rights. In that deed, they will talk about what you can do with it. And what kind of deed is it? We're going to learn those different types in a little bit. In this case, it's something called a general warranty deed. Sorry. So we'll get into that too. When does title get transferred? When is it considered to have been transferred? So under common law, like legal terms, common law based on court cases, title transfers when the deed is delivered to the buyer and the buyer voluntarily accepts it. That's the official common law definition of transfer of title. It's delivered, but that's not enough. It must also be voluntarily accepted, not forced to have accepted or involuntary, not forced to have accepted or involuntarily accepted. But we take it a step further in North Carolina. The title is only officially considered to have transferred when that deed is recorded at the courthouse in the Register of Deeds office. How can you record something? How does somebody go about recording a deed or recording any document? You can either go there in person to the Register of Deeds office and say, here, I want to record this document. And they'll say, okay, that'll be $20. It's like 20, 30, $40, something like that. Depends on how many pages. Or you could do it online. Log in to the Register of Deeds office and record the deed electronically over the internet, which is probably how most attorneys, paralegals do this. So the sequence of events at a closing is this. You meet on the settlement day. The seller goes in to the attorney's office conference room, seller and the listing agent and the attorney or maybe a paralegal, and they say, here, sign this and this and this. And that seller signs probably about 5 documents. One of them is the deed. By the way, the seller, write this one down. The seller is the only one who signs the deed. The buyer does not. The seller is called the grantor. They're granting the deed to the buyer, who is the grantee. So only the grantor signs the deed. Sort of like when you sell your car. Seller signs the title to the car over to the buyer. Okay, so you've got the seller, goes in that conference room with the attorney and the listing agent, signs their handful of papers, takes about 15 or 20 minutes, depending on how many questions they might ask. Then they're done. And in this day and age, they pretty much leave. They also sign something called a settlement statement that we'll learn about when we get to the chapter on closing procedures. That settlement statement is the document that shows every dime, every penny that each party pays or gets, buyer and seller. So we can see exactly every route of every penny. So they'll sign that too. And then they're gone. Then the buyer comes in with their buyer agent if they have one, and the attorney, and sign a whole lot more documents, especially if they're borrowing money. If they have a mortgage, it's probably going to be about 2 inches thick worth of papers. And they'll sign here and here and here, and initial there and there and there. Once all of that signing is done, the attorney, paralegal, will scan all those documents and send them up to the lender who's going to loan the money for this thing. And the lender wants to look through everything, make sure everything got signed and initialed properly. The lender will say, yep, looks good, great job. We will fund the loan. And they've probably already done it by now, but they'll wire all $500,000 of the loan amount, or $300 or whatever, to the attorney's account. And then the attorney will use that money plus any down payment money the buyer might have brought with them in the form of either wiring or a check, certified check, and they will divvy it all up and spread that money out to all the various places that need to be paid, like broker commissions, like the home warranty the seller agreed to pay for the buyer. Anything that the buyer is supposed to pay comes from that amount. And it's the attorney who splits all the money up into the right place. Some of that money will need to be mailed to the county, to the government in the form of property tax bill. Some of it will maybe depends on when you're closing. Some of it will be given to the buyer, some of it will be given to the seller. And ultimately, we want to see what is the amount of money the buyer needs to bring with them to closing. And we want to see what is the amount of money the seller is going to get from having sold the house. Okay, the lender has now looked through it all, verified and approved it and said, yep, looks good. You did everything right. It's also, or if they missed a spot, they'll say, we need a signature and initial on this page. You missed one. Once all that's done, the buyer goes away. They're not getting the keys yet. It's going to take an hour or 2 or 3 because they're going to go away while this attorney sends all the docs to the lender to make sure they're done right and the lender's happy and the lender funds the loan. And then once the lender gives it the final okay and says, yep, looks good, you are safe, attorney is safe to go record it or to go online and record the deed with the Register of Deeds. The attorney will do one more look at the property, make sure no additional liens were added since the last time they checked. They probably checked like a week ago. They did the official title search and checked for liens and other things. They're going to check one more time because maybe in the last week or day or hour or minute, another mechanic's lien popped up. That means like a roofer came along and said, I didn't get paid, I want my money. Make sure no other liens got added. Once that checks out, they then go on file and record that deed. And once that deed is recorded, we are closed. That is the official closing moment. That is also when the seller can get their check. And most importantly, you get your check for commission. And then also when the buyer can get the keys and start moving in. So it's the recording in North Carolina is considered acceptance. That acceptance occurs when that deed is recorded at the Register of Deeds. Does that make sense? Let's take a break. I'll see you in 10. Hey, we're back. Come on back in. Let's keep on going. So we talked about a very important point, a very testable point, and that is that in North Carolina, acceptance occurs when that deed has been recorded. My voice is starting to get a little weird, so forgive me. It requires delivery of the deed and acceptance, voluntary acceptance. And what is acceptance in North Carolina? Acceptance is at the point it gets recorded. So look for that on practice exams and on the real exam. Here are some more terms to know. We know that alienation means transferring the property. That's the getting rid of, the selling it, or maybe the giving it away. And we could either alienate it voluntarily, meaning because we chose to sell it or we chose to give it, or we could alienate ourselves from it involuntarily, which is sad. Just like with liens, voluntary lien is happy, involuntary lien is sad. Well, voluntary alienation is happy because you're choosing to. Involuntary alienation is because you were made to. You lost it. Maybe you lost it to foreclosure or through court action. You got sued. The judge said you got to give up your house as a part of this lawsuit. Some other terms. This applies to when you leave property behind in a will. When someone dies and leaves their property to their heirs, the person carrying out the wishes of that deceased person is called the executor. Traditionally, there was a male version of the word and a female version of the word. So the male version is executor, and the female version is my favorite. It's called executrix. Executrix, T-R-I-X. Words with X in them are pretty rare. But that's who's handling the estate. That's who's going down to the courthouse and saying, this person died. Now I need to get their affairs in order. I need to I need to open probate for settling this person's estate. That's what it's called. The legal process of handling their estate, getting their affairs wrapped up and settled is called the probate process. If you're giving your property to someone through this probate process, the one who's receiving it is the beneficiary. You could also think of it as like the beneficiary of a will, because that real estate might be one of several things that's being given in the person's will, in the dead person's will. So executor carries out the provisions. Probate is the actual process, and the beneficiary or the beneficiaries are the ones who are getting the various assets or properties. It might be more than real estate. The beneficiary, the oldest daughter might get the real estate, the middle daughter might get the car, the youngest son might get the collectible watches, right? But we're talking about real estate here, but it still applies either way, that beneficiary. So what happens to real estate when an owner dies? If the owner dies with a will in place, the word for that is called dying testate. 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 They died with a will. It's better to die testate than it is to die intestate. Intestate means you died with no will. And therefore, you don't have as many choices about what happens to your property because you didn't tell anybody what to do with it. So dying testate with a will is a version of voluntary alienation. You're choosing, once you die, what's going to happen to your property. And that's the best way to make sure your wishes are fulfilled once you die. Dying intestate means without the will. That's a version of involuntary alienation because guess what? Your property's not just going to sit there unclaimed. If you die with no will and no heirs, your property doesn't just sit there forever and ever and ever. Why? What's one reason that your property can't just sit there unclaimed by anyone ever? Let's say it's paid off. There's no loan on it. Is there ever really no payment on a property? Catherine says no, because you still got to pay the taxes. Exactly. Exactly right. Yeah. Well, in North Carolina, that's why we have that little symbol down there. If you die with no will or no heirs, this is a testable item, the property will eventually be taken over by the state of North Carolina. What is that legal process called? A weird word there at the bottom. Escheat. Escheat. E-S-C-H-E-A-T. Escheat. North Carolina can take your property if you die with no will and no heirs. And therefore, since you, through not having a will, didn't give them instructions otherwise, that's involuntary alienation. So maybe a test question would be, which of the following words is a type of involuntary alienation? And if escheat is in that list of words, that's probably the answer. That might be the way that they ask such a question. Voluntary is happier. The owner's making the choices. The owner's either choosing to sell it or choosing to gift it or writing it up in a will, choosing to declare who's going to get it. That's voluntarily alienating one's property because the owner's choosing. And then the sad version is usually a court-ordered kind of a thing, not something the owner's happy about against their wishes. Another version of involuntary alienation is this thing, the foreclosure of your mortgage. That was the deal when you borrowed the money to buy this property. You agreed, if I don't pay the house payment, I can't stay in the house. Not sure how many house payments you have to miss before they might foreclose. You might get away with quite a few. Back when the market was changing back in 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, the banks were so backed up that some people were still in their house after not making any house payment for as long as a year or more. The bank just couldn't get around to everybody. So they got away with free room and board until they didn't, until they finally lost it. They eventually lost it. So lien foreclosure, if you don't pay, you don't stay. The lien holder takes the property to pay off the debts that you owe. And what gives them the right to do that? What gives that mortgage company the right to take your property through foreclosure? Tell me in the chat. Let me ask it this way. Who gives them the right to take your property in foreclosure? Those are good guesses. Well, you do. The one who buys the property using the loan. You have to sign the mortgage. In North Carolina, actually, it's called a deed of trust, but it's the same thing. Part of signing that mortgage is saying this: if I don't pay, I won't stay. You'll take it. In other words, that deed of trust or that mortgage is pledging the property as collateral for the loan that you're borrowing from that lender. So If you don't pay it back the way you told them you would, then you give them permission up front to eventually take it from you. When they choose to do that is up to them. They might choose to start the foreclosure process if you're only a couple of months behind, or maybe 4, 5, 6, whatever. It depends on stuff. We also talked about this kind of involuntary alienation. We touched on it a little bit, and this is the one where if that petitioning party, meaning the person petitioning the court, could say and prove, look, I used this property. It wasn't mine, but I used it openly, continuously, exclusively. No one else besides me used it. Certainly not the owner, just me. Adversely and notoriously for 20 years consecutively, then the court might actually grant the property to them. That is called adverse possession. Sort of like squatters' rights, if you've ever heard of that or seen some videos about such a thing. And the 20 years is not even the only requirement. That's only if the property has no cloud on the title, meaning no complications with the deed. If there's no cloud, it takes 20 years continuously, openly, exclusively, adversely, notoriously. If there is a cloud, it might only require 7 years. What were you doing 7 years ago? What if you found some abandoned property and started just moving into it, using it openly, continuously, exclusively, adversely, notoriously? This year, you'd be able to go to the court, say to the judge, look, I did this. I used it in all these ways. Give it to me. And you might have a shot at it. So that owner would have been losing it or alienating it from themselves involuntarily through adverse possession. There's the how long it takes again. Adverse possession needs to be continuously for 20 years if it's a nice clear title, or only 7 years if it's a clouded title. Now, anybody ever heard of like Area 51? Or when that balloon traveled over the country, all the government land it flew over? Well, sorry to say, those neighbors that back up to that government land that nobody ever drives on, the government forgot about, you can't do this with that. If this weren't in there, then a lot of people could do it because the government doesn't know what all land it has. They're not going over every acre all the time. It's only for private property, not government property. That's exempt from possibly being lost through adverse possession, right? Here's that concept of escheat again. The escheat word means that the government has a reversionary right to take your property when it's abandoned. It's abandoned when someone dies without leaving it in a will and has no heirs to leave it to. What if they die with no will, but they do have some heirs? Well, the government's going to try to find those heirs. The government's going to say, who is it? There's no will for us to go by. Let's do some research. Did they have kids? No kids? Did they have parents that are living? That's the next in line. I think after parents, it's like maybe siblings, brothers, sisters. I think after them, it might be aunts or uncles, something like that. So it kind of goes down the list. There's a certain order of heirs that would be next in line. Kids are first, parents are second. So they would try to find heirs. And if they couldn't find any, then they could take it over through this process of escheat. Another method, so again, escheat is a version of involuntary alienation. See a theme emerging here? Another one is this. Anybody heard of eminent domain? Eminent domain. It's the source of a couple of good movies, but what it is, let's say that house at the Pink Arrow. That house is right there on the edge of the road, and that's a 4-lane road. I wonder maybe once upon a time that might have been only a 2-lane road. And if it was a 2-lane road, look how much yard that house would have had. It happens to be where that little cart or the car or whatever that is driving. So just by looking at how close the road is to the building, it might have been that sometime over the years, the government said it's in the best interest of the public, for the good of the public, that we take over part of your yard. We'll pay you for it, fair market value, whatever that is. In exchange, we're chopping your front yard in half so we can widen this road so it benefits the public, right? The greater good. That's the concept of eminent domain. It can be more than just putting in a road. Could be other reasons why the government might want to condemn a property through eminent domain, but it's not that they can just take it. They do have to pay you for it. They'd pay you whatever is considered fair compensation as determined by an appraisal. Odds are your definition of fair compensation might be a little higher than what theirs is, but there's not much you can do about it, although you do, as you see the third bullet point, as an owner, you would have access to due process, meaning you could take them to court over it if you disagree. But I talked to a guy in my class today who actually does something related to this. He's called a right-of-way. What's he called? A right-of-way agent. That's what he's called. He's getting into the business with his brother, and basically that they help the general public understand how all this sort of thing works. And he said, yeah, owners could take the government to court through this thing, but they rarely win. Again, the government takes your property as long as they can prove it's for the greater good of the public, and they have to compensate you for it. It can't just be for one person's benefit or for a profit of like an entity or a developer who wants to just make money. That probably wouldn't be something that would fly. It would have to be proven to be for the greater good. No, Joseph asks, does it happen a lot? And I guess it depends on the area and what it is. I don't think it's like these huge chunks of acreage or anything. It might just be little sections just here and there to kind of make some drain line or a runoff area work properly, or a road cutting through. Now, those were methods of involuntary alienation. Let's talk about the deed again. What is it that makes a deed considered to be valid? Now, keep in mind what we're talking about here with these essential elements. We're not saying that these are the only pieces of information that should be on the deed. There's more stuff that you should put on the deed. There's more stuff that ends up being in the deed. But these are the things that make the deed valid or not. The deed is either going to be valid or invalid depending on whether these things are in it. If it's an invalid deed, it's not good enough, right? It's not a valid deed. It's not good. It's not proper. So at the bare minimum, it needs to have these things. There are some other things a deed should have, but those are called non-essential. And I'll go back. I'm not just blasting through these. These are good ideas. Each of these items here are pretty much on every deed, but they're not required for that deed to be considered valid. Do you see the difference? Don't think that just because those other things are the essential ones and these are non-essential, that these are never on there. Because for one thing, notice this one. It is a non-essential element of a deed that it be recorded at the Register of Deeds. But we already learned that the deed's not considered to have been delivered until it's recorded. So it has to be recorded. All that means is the fact that it's recorded or not doesn't affect its validity. It's still a valid deed even if it doesn't get recorded. But it does need to be recorded so that we can have an official closing in North Carolina. So let's focus on these essential elements first. If you had to decide what should be essential elements on a deed, probably going to come up with most of these things. Need to write it down. If you're going to prove that you're the owner, let's put it in writing. Let's have not an oral deed or verbal deed. We need a written deed. So number one essential element of a deed is that it be in writing so that you can enforce it. take it to court and say, yes, this is mine. See, it's right here in writing. When we see the word grantor, we're talking about the owner or the one who's giving it, right? Conveying it. In order to be a valid deed, the grantor giving the deed to the buyer or to the grantee, that grantor must be 18, sane, and sober. 18, sane, and sober. That's what legal capacity means. And we'll see that phrase again. When we see somebody needs to be legal, have legal capacity, they need to be of age, need to have been sober when they signed it, and they need to be sane. Able to handle their own affairs. Someone with dementia could end up being a challenge on this deed's validity because they can't handle their own affairs, especially if someone else has been given the responsibility for taking care of that person's affairs. So that grantor must be 18, sane, and sober. Both buyer and seller, giver and receiver, grantor and grantee, both of them must be identified on the deed. But while they are both mentioned and identified on the deed, only one of them signs it. Which one signs it? You got it. The grantee does not sign. The buyer does not sign. When you bought that car, you didn't sign the title. The seller signed the title over to you. I think that's the same way it works. But it's definitely how it works in real estate. What else do we have to have as an essential element of that deed? Well, we need to make sure it's the right property. So let's make sure it's adequately identified. What's it going to require for adequate identification? What do you think? Good. Yeah, but what's the survey there to reveal? What's the name of that type of description? An adequate identification. There we go. Yeah, a legal description. It could be any of those three. Could be meets and bounds or a reference to a recorded deed or a reference to a recorded plat. Some kind of legal description would be adequate identification. Address would not be enough. It would need to be one of those other three also. You would definitely include the address, but that wouldn't be adequate. And then on the deed, the attorney needs to write what's happening. What is the purpose of this deed? What's taking place? And that's called adequate words of conveyance. We're acknowledging that this grantor is giving it to this grantee in exchange for whatever. So adequate words of conveyance are another essential element. Needs to be signed by the grantor, and then finally, that deed, as we already saw, needs to be delivered and then also voluntarily accepted. And what is it in North Carolina that signifies that moment at which it's voluntarily accepted? When it's recorded. Perfect. I know it's confusing because we just said the essential elements of a valid deed are voluntary or delivery and voluntarily accepted. But then when we look at non-essential, it says recorded. So keep in mind, this is more of a national thing. According to the national section of the exam, voluntary acceptance is not necessarily being recorded in all states. It just so happens in North Carolina. But if you saw on the test, is it an essential element of a valid deed for it to be recorded? Then the answer is no, because recording is a non-essential element. It doesn't affect the validity. It's not what makes the deed valid. The recording is required because in North Carolina, to be considered having closed, it has to be recorded. And I know that's a little confusing. In the chat, somebody said the grantor is the seller, the giver of the deed, or the one who's selling it. Who's the grantor? It's the seller. So those are the essential elements. Now, again, the non-essential elements are also in the deed usually in real life, but they don't affect whether it becomes a valid deed or not. It's still valid even if it didn't have any of these things. but they're a good idea, and they're probably going to be on there. It needs to be dated. It should be, but that's a non-essential element. It needs to be witnessed by like a notary public, but not essential. Recorded, but not essential. Notarized, acknowledged, kind of like the witnessing thing. An exact amount of consideration. Typical deed in North Carolina doesn't necessarily have what the purchase price was, but it will have something referenced on there called excise tax. The old school version name for that is revenue stamps, tax stamps. When you record that deed back in the day, that Register of Deeds employee would collect your excise tax money and then tear off a couple of stamps to equate that amount of money and stick them to the deed. They don't do it that way anymore. It's all done in writing. They say, here's the excise tax. Did you pay it? Okay. And they write it in there. But that's about the only way you can usually work backwards and figure out what the price of the property was. They don't usually have the price on the deed. But if they did, that'd be okay. But having it or not having it does not affect its validity. Still a valid deed without the consideration. When we see the word consideration, that just means how much, what you paid for it. What sort of item of value did you pay? Did you trade a herd of horses and cattle and goats and a couple of tractors, or was it money? It was probably money, right? But that exact amount of consideration is a non-essential element. The word sealed goes back, Game of Thrones is not real history, but it's based on, those medieval times. And back in the day when there was no U.S. Postal Service, you'd have some king with a ring called a signet ring, right? And he would melt wax on the scroll of the thing he wrote to someone else, melt the wax, stick his ring in it, and that's his seal. And that way the person he sends it to, 3 years later when it finally reaches them via horseback and walking and whatever else, they see that that seal is unbroken, and therefore they know that no one else has read it. So that's the concept we're talking about with the word sealed. We don't do waxes and rings anymore, but the word sealed might show up next to your signature in parentheses. If you've ever seen a legal document, that might be something you've noticed. It's not that important anymore. It's not really, especially in what we do. So as we see here, it's a non-essential element, but that's all they're talking about there. And then, as we already learned, the grantee, the one receiving the deed, they don't sign it. The buyer doesn't, they don't need to sign the deed. It's just the seller. That's the grantor who signs the deed over. So here's the parties. The seller is the one who's giving the property or selling the property and therefore the deed, also called the grantor. The buyer is the grantee. They're the one receiving it, right? Grantee, receiving it, the one who's getting it. Notice these words, OR and EE. We're going to see those come back around in different chapters and different topics. So grantor and grantee mean the giver and receiver of the deed, the seller and the buyer. Offeror and offeree mean the giver and receiver of the offer, the buyer and the seller. See, the buyer's giving the offer, so they're the OR one. And then let's say the buyer makes an offer, but the seller doesn't like it. And they say, nope, not willing to do that, but I will do this. That's called a counteroffer. And when that seller makes a counteroffer, they become the offeror and the buyer becomes the offeree. So that's what we're talking about beside the word counter. If we're talking about rentals, then the landlord is the one giving the lease to the tenant. So the landlord is the lessor, the tenant is the lessee. If we're talking about a mortgage, that one's confusing. Because I bet if I didn't show you this and I asked you, who's the mortgagor? The borrower, or the lender? I would have guessed wrong. I would have guessed it's called the lender. But think about it this way. The mortgagor is giving the collateral as support for getting the loan. So the buyer or the borrower is giving the lender the mortgage. So therefore they are the mortgagor. The lender's the mortgagee. When we get into contracts, we'll learn what an option to purchase is. And so the one giving the option to purchase is the seller. And the one receiving the option to purchase is the buyer, the optionee. Optionor, seller, optionee, buyer. What is an option to purchase? Anybody know? What can you tell me about an option to purchase? Are you buying the property when you buy an option? There's really no reason for you to know. I'm just asking. When someone pays for an option to purchase, yeah, they're basically saying, hey, seller, I'm not sure if I want to buy it yet or not, but I definitely want to be first in line and have time to make my decision without other people getting it ahead of me. So you're paying as an optionor, an optionee as a buyer, you're paying for the amount of time that seller's going to give you to decide later. It might be because you want to see if the zoning board is going to rule to change the zoning use and allow you to do with that property what you really want to do. If they will, that property is going to be worth more to you. If they won't, you don't want to buy it. So that's going to take maybe 3 or 4, 6 months. So maybe you give the seller like $5,000 as an option fee for the privilege of sitting there and agreeing not to take an offer from anyone else and giving you a year to decide if you want to buy it or not. That's what an option to purchase is. It involves an option fee. It's non-refundable because you're buying that amount of time. And so the one doing the buying of the option is the optionee. The one giving them time to make their decision is the optionor. This last one is probably the weirdest looking one. A contract for deed. When you see that phrase, just think seller financing. The seller is going to be the bank. So the buyer is buying the property from the seller, and they're not going to go to a bank to fund it. They're just going to basically pay the seller in monthly installments instead of a big chunk up front. The seller is going to give them the mortgage themselves. They're going to be the bank. The seller is going to sell it to them for a purchase price and then also charge them interest. And so in a contract for deed type of thing, seller financing, the seller is called the vendor and the buyer is called the vendee. That's about all you need to know about contracts for deed. We don't go into depth there. In fact, if a client you run into wants to do a contract for deed, whether it's a seller wants you to help them find a buyer/borrower to do this thing, or the buyer/borrower hires you and wants you to help them find a seller willing to do seller financing, there's no form. There's no standard offer to purchase available for this because it's such a unique thing. It needs to be a combination of a contract and a financing document rolled into one. And we're not qualified to write such a thing. As brokers, we're not allowed to write legal language, and they don't make a standard form for us to use for a contract for deed. So we'd essentially have to reach out to an attorney. Say, look, I got this buyer who wants to do seller financing from this seller over here. Make us up a custom contract for deed for this situation. So we'll see these words again. Okay. Now, there are multiple types of deeds that accomplish different things. The best kind of deed is the one that says, I'm the seller and I promise to you, Mr. and Ms. Buyer, that I will stand behind this property forever and ever. I will promise that there's never going to be any problem, never anyone else that'll come along and claim ownership, like they own 3% of it, or there won't be any clouds or any issues ever. That's the best possible kind of deed you could give someone. And it's called a general warranty deed. Unfortunately, it's a terrible name Because if I was thinking what would be the best, most special kind of deed, I'd probably call it a special warranty deed, but that's not how it works. The best kind of deed is a general warranty deed. It comes with itself, it brings to the table 5 promises, 5 covenants. General warranty deed says, I'm making 5 promises to you, buyer. I'm the seller. I promise you these 5 things. We'll see what those are in a minute. But they essentially amount to saying this: I'm the seller and I'll defend the title to this property against any claims made against it from now on into forever. That's a pretty bold claim. How does anybody want to have that, take on that responsibility? We'll talk about that too in a minute. The general warranty deed has 5 such covenants that pretty much amounts to defending the title forever against everything. The special warranty deed only says, look, I'll stand behind this deed and defend the title, but only for the amount of time that I was the actual owner. I don't know what people did before me, so I'm not going to stand behind it for any time that I didn't own it, and that's called a special warranty deed. There's 2 of those 5 covenants or promises involved when it's a special warranty deed. And then this last one here, although there are more, but a quit claim deed means that that giver of the deed is not standing behind anything. They're making no promises. They're saying, look, yes, I'm the owner and I'll sell it to you, but I'm not promising you anything. This is a quit claim deed. Another word you might see it called is a bargain and sale deed. So no amount of warranty standing behind it at all. Let's talk about the general warranty deed first. That seller is guaranteeing the title to be solid, clear, not clouded, to be a good title. No other person can come along and say they co-own it. Seller's promising no problems from this title from the past, from the time they owned it too, and also in the future. 100% guarantee, no question. I'll give you a spoiler. It's due in part that they can do this forever because they bought title insurance. And part of that title insurance is to help stand behind this title to this property. But we'll learn about that more in a minute. So what are those promises? That seller is saying these things. I'm giving you these 5 covenants or these 5 promises. The covenant of Taxation. That's a weird word. It comes again from the medieval times. And the idea here is, let's say you and me are standing on the hilltop and I'm showing you all down through the valley that I own, that I'm going to sell to you. And I'm sort of like just spreading my arm across and saying, that is all that I'm giving you. That's everything I'm selling you. It's from those trees over there to the ocean over there to the mountains in the distance. It's all mine. And now I'm going to give it to you or sell it to you. That's this idea of the covenant of Taxation. This is my property, and this is what I'm transferring to you for this amount of consideration, right? So that covenant of Taxation, identifying the property essentially. The covenant of encumbrances is saying, look, I'm going to sell you this property, and I'm not going to sell it to you with any liens on it. I promise it will be free of any liens. If there are liens on it, I will clear them up. And so when you buy it and you're the owner, you won't have to deal with them. I'm going to settle them up, clear them up before I sell it to you. The covenant of quiet enjoyment, number 3. That's the one that says, I will stand behind it and protect this deed from any third-party people that can come out of the woodwork from years and years ago and say, no, I've got a contract that proves I own 15% of that. So you're standing and protecting against any third-party claims against the property. That's the covenant of quiet enjoyment. Not keep the radio down, but no other parties will come along. The covenant of further assurance says, this is the big part of what makes it a general warranty deed. It says, look, if you need my help in the future to track down information and make sure that this is still a solid deed and I did what I said I was going to do, I promise I'll help you clear it up in the future. And then 5, forever. the covenant of warranty forever. Even after the sale is done, I will still stand behind it. Now, what if there is a problem that somehow crops up? And so the new owner tracks down this seller and says, remember, you sold this to me with a general warranty deed. You agreed to track down whatever you help track down and fix the problem. Now there's a problem. What are you going to do about it? What if that seller is broke or dead? How can they do this? They can't. That's where the title insurance kicks in. If the seller doesn't have enough money to fix a thing because maybe the fence is encroaching and they finally discover this and it clouds the title, or who knows, whatever else, some other person can come along, the title policy is going to still be in effect and still cover them. And that's why you want title insurance, to protect just in case that seller in the future dies or is too broke, maybe doesn't have enough money to help correct a problem in the future. I don't know how often this sort of thing happens. I can imagine probably not very often. And the reason this is a system like this, and there's title insurance like there is to keep it from happening. So we'll learn about that title insurance and search process in a minute. So that's the general warranty deed. Seller stands behind it all in the past, in the present, and in the future, giving these 5 covenants. The special warranty deed is pretty much saying, I'm only guaranteeing that it was nice and safe and clear and no third parties, just for the amount of time I owned it, nothing more. Just 2 of those 5 guarantees. And the reason I have this graphic for the foreclosure is when you buy a property from a bank, because it was a bank foreclosure, because they took it back from a borrower, then that bank is not going to give you a general warranty deed. They're not going to stand behind it in the past, in the present, and forever in the future. They're just going to say, we will give you a special warranty deed and guarantee it just for the amount of time that we were the owner. And that might have only been 6 months or a year because they took it back from the person through foreclosure and now they've put it back on the market. Maybe I found that banks, when they take properties and they put them on the market, it might take 9 months to a year between when they start the foreclosure and when they finally have it settled to the point where they can sell it and list it for sale. When you see the initials REO property, that stands for real estate owned, which means real estate owned by a bank. So REO properties are bank-owned properties that are foreclosed, right? And that's why you can get them for a pretty good deal, because the bank's just trying to get what they have in it, usually. They'll take as much as they can get, but if they can at least get their loan amount that they've loaned for it that the person defaulted on, that might be a way for you to get it for a discount. But what you're going to get from them is not a general warranty deed. It will only be a special warranty deed. Quitclaim deed, again, means no guarantees at all. Not 5, not 2, none. And it's pretty much saying, look, I own it. I'm selling it to you. Take it or leave it. They may not even have claim to the title. So it's not the best one. It's just pretty bare bones and basic. A bargain and sale deed is something also without any guarantees included. The owner does have a claim to the title, and it's used typically to clear up a cloud on the title. They fix a problem, and they're going to reissue a bargain and sale deed to acknowledge that cloud was cleared up. So the difference between a bargain and sale deed and a quitclaim deed, the quitclaim may or may not have claim to the title. The bargain and sale deed means that they do have a claim to the title. This is just definition stuff, guys. Don't get too caught up in it. Don't get sweat it too bad. Some other kinds of deeds, a correction deed, if there's a typo. They needed to fix a mistake in the deed, so they'll issue a correction deed because they needed to fix a spelling or something. A gift deed is what's used when somebody's giving property to someone else for free. No consideration needed. It's a gift. But here's the thing about a gift deed. If you ever get one from someone, hurry up and record it. If you don't record it within 2 years, they can take it back from you. So if they give it to you, thank them and get your tail on over to the courthouse and record that thing so you can keep it. A release deed is a happy deed because it means you're done making your payments. You've paid the entire loan. The entire mortgage is paid off. So back in the day, people would pay off their house and they'd have what they call a mortgage burning party. They'd burn the mortgage paperwork because they don't need it because the loan's paid off. Well, this is what you get to signify that you've paid off the loan. The lender will give you a release deed, releasing the property from the mortgage. It is no longer collateral for that loan. There's a handful of things here. These next three, or these next two, are both things that happen from a court action, from litigation. So the judge or the court would order these things, a trustee's deed or a sheriff's deed, something related to a foreclosure or a judgment against the person. And then a tax deed is another kind of deed. So again, surface level, level 1, definitions about these types of deeds. Name 3 kinds of deeds that we just talked about. Indeed. Good job. Still awake, hanging in there. All right, let's take a break, go run around the block, do some jumping jacks, get that blood pumping, and let's come back in about 10 minutes and we'll knock out the last 40 minutes or so, 45. See you in 10. Welcome back. Let's come on back together for the last 50 minutes or so. Let's change up a little bit because I can appreciate that this is kind of dry material. I know that it kind of gets a little old. So we're going to come back around to some of this stuff, but let's look at this one that requires a little interaction first. Excise tax, pretty straightforward. Remember, it's not the same concept as property tax. Property tax is what an owner pays for the property every year because they own it. Excise tax is what the seller, when they choose to sell it, has to pay because they sold it. It's essentially a sales tax. The way we figure it out mathematically is the formula is $1 for every $500 of sale price. So what does that mean? If the property sells, sale price of $137,000, we just divide that by 500. So 137,000 divided by $500 means that the seller is going to have to pay $274 for excise tax. So things of note here, it's about sale price, not tax value, right? And then the other thing is, what if it's not a nice even number? What if instead of $137,000, it's $137,300? Now, when we try to divide it by 500, we get some change. 274.60. Well, guess what? The government don't have no sense. They don't want your change. Round it up. They want 275. So when calculating excise tax, you have to round it up. You could do it two different ways. This is my favorite way. But the other way you could do it is, here's our price of $137,300. You could round that up, and you would round it up to the next available $500. So you would round it up to $137,500 and then divide that by 500. And that's going to give you the exact number. There's our 275. So either one works. I just like the first method because I can remember, oh yeah, round up the change, 275. But it doesn't matter. Whichever one sticks in your memory the best. That's excise tax. So you tell me in the chat, what's the excise tax if the property sells for $319,250? That's the sale price. If the loan amount is $300,000 even, and if the assessed tax value is $275,000. What's the excise tax? The excise tax, essentially, it's going to the government. It's a sales tax that goes to the government when you sell your property. I threw all that stuff at you because they do. On the test, they might throw in some extra stuff, and so part of it is knowing which one of these do we need to use for excise tax. We don't use loan amount. We don't use tax value. We use sale price. So $319,250 divided by 500 is $638.50, which we need to round up to $639. Good job. That's it. That's excise tax. One of the easier ones. Now let's learn a little bit about what it means, what we're doing with it. Another word for it for most old timers might be revenue stamps, tax stamps, deed stamps, because it literally looked like this. Something like that. They would put that on the deed, some sort of a tax stamp, like a real stamp. You'd pay them the money, they'd tear them off and they'd stick them on the deed, but they don't do it that way anymore. They just acknowledge that you paid it. Because why? Why bother with stamps, right? So, okay, there's the calculation. And in this case, we've got sale price of $321,457. We're rounding. We're rounding it up to the next 500, dividing that by 500 to get the 643. But I like method 2 here better. Take the price, divide by 500, and then round what you get to the next dollar. What about this one? Property sold for $793,618. The buyer purchased it with a loan in the amount of $650. How much will North Carolina charge the buyer for excise tax? And how much will North Carolina charge the seller for excise tax? Good job. It was a dirty, dirty trick. Sorry, guys. Please forgive me. This buyer one was a decoy. They don't charge the buyer anything for excise tax, right? The buyer doesn't have to pay it. It's the seller who pays it. So how much will North Carolina charge the buyer for excise tax? Nothing. How much will they charge the seller? Let's take that purchase price divided by 500. Here it is in the version of a T formula or circle formula, and that's all we're doing. 1587.236 becomes 1588. Hopefully you forgive me. Let's stay on track, and we're going to skip some more boring stuff and do some stuff that actually requires some proactivity, some movement. You might be like, well, math's pretty boring, but at least you're doing something, right? Instead of listening. Okay. Let's talk about that acreage and area thing. To get the area of a shape, like a rectangle is 30 feet across. Let's pretend that's a good rectangle. About 20 feet deep. That's a lot, a really tiny, tiny lot. What's the area of this shape? 30 by 20. We're just going 30 times 20, right? You can make it a T formula if you want to. 600. So that is 600 square feet. Square feet. Because we're dividing it into this many square feet, which is 600, theoretically. So with that, here's our road. Here's our road frontage. By the way, write this one down. Front feet. That's the first measurement because that's the street frontage, the road frontage. Anytime you see a string of measurements like 325 by 157 by 325 by 157, the first number is the amount on the road, also called front feet or front footage. Square feet is the area inside the shape. Front feet is the first dimension, the one on the road. So you'll need to know both. What's front feet compared to square feet? Square feet's going to be bigger because it's the length times the width, right? Front feet's going to be just that one measurement across the road frontage. But in this case, if we're looking for square feet, the grassy part, how are we going to get that? Beautiful. And that's a big fat number, 51,025 square feet. A lot. How do we turn that into little old ladies? 4 of them going 35 in a 60. How do we turn that into acres? We want to turn this 51,025 square feet into how many acres would that be? We're going to need to use that number and this number. Yeah, there it is. There's our T formula. Put that 50 whatever thousand on top, divide it by the 43,560. That gives us 1.17 acres. Good. And notice what we did. We had two numbers on the bottom multiplied together to equal the number on the top. In fact, 43,560 is sort of like a rate. It's sort of a rate. And I told you before that we put a rate on the bottom for taxes. Well, this is a rate. It's the rate of 43,560 square feet per acre. That's a rate. Anytime something is per something, it's a rate. So it's essentially the same concept. Now, if the question goes further, because guess what? In real estate, we want to know how much things cost, not just how big they are. So how do we calculate the cost of the land if we know that through our research we've discovered land in this area sells for $14,500 per acre? We know how much the acreage is now. We just figured that out to be 1.17. Just multiply that by the amount per acre. Oh, look, we just said the word per again. Another rate. That's a rate this time. $14,500 per acre times the amount of acres gives us a cost for this lot of $16,965. So being able to go back and forth between square feet an acre and then turning it into price per acre, that's some easy points. If you just do several repetitions of it. In the back of the book, let me think. Is it this one? Let me double check. If not, I have a whole entire math workbook that no, yeah, it is the back of this one. Yeah. Different book. Yeah, this is the book that has quite a bit of helpful information. Good. Here's your book. And if you go to the back, don't forget you've got math appendix. Introduction, oh, that's a calculator thing. Measurement problems, there we go. So spend some time looking back through there. It'll talk to you about acreage versus square feet. I think we're about page 777. That'll be easy to remember, somewhere in that vicinity. And if you keep on going, it just handles shapes, helps you remember how to do shapes, including square feet to acres. Okay. So let's talk about that square footage compared to front footage concept. In this problem we've been working on, the front footage was 325 feet. The depth of this lot back from the road, 157. And therefore the square footage was those two things multiplied together to give 51025. So if, for instance, front footage matters more in commercial real estate. Why do you think commercial brokers in the commercial real estate world care more about what the front footage is than maybe what the square footage is? What's important about front footage, road frontage? Good job. Exposure, right? Yeah, so it can be seen. You bet. That's more valuable, probably. So in a commercial purchase, it might be that the property is worth $20,000 per front foot. I don't know if that's even remotely reasonable, but if that were the case, that'd be worth $6.5 million for this 325 foot road frontage. Conversely, we found out that at $14,500 per acre, it was only worth $16,900. I think I'll choose to sell it commercially if those are real numbers, right? What about this one? Lot dimensions are 450 feet by 730 feet. Land is selling in the area for $37.65 per acre. How much should this lot sell for? It's okay if this takes a little bit. Take your time. When you're ready, you can put your answer in the chat. It's fine. I've got it set to private. Elevator thinking music. How about this? Step 1, let's figure out the square footage. 450 by 730, 328,500 square feet. Step 2, let's figure out the acres. 328.5 divided by the little old ladies, 7.54 acres. Step 3, let's figure out the price of this lot at $37.65 per acre. 7.54 acres times $37.65 per acre means it's worth $28,388. Good job. If you had any little bit of a variation here, it might be because of rounding. You might have left a number in the calculator and kept going instead of clearing it out and putting back in the rounded. It doesn't matter. They're not going to give you that answer choice on the test. They won't test you to the point of a rounding error. So if it's close enough, that's probably good enough. If you had trouble, I would try clearing it out real good. Hit that clear button several times. Make sure there's no numbers left in the calculator, maybe residually, and try again. But that 450 by 730 should come out to 328.5. And then that 328.5 divided by 43,560, being careful not to add too many zeros or something, should show the 7.54. How about this one? How much would it cost if the property is selling instead for per acre for $1,200 per front foot? There's the dimensions again. Sells for $1,200 per front foot. You can choose which one. You can just have the zoning changed maybe. Choose to sell it residentially for acres or commercially per front foot. At $1,200 per front foot, how much would it be worth? You want to see about maybe changing that zoning to commercial? Yeah, let's do that. Because we'd be looking at 540,000. You bet. Just that first dimension, because that's the front footage, times $1,200 per front foot. That's all that is. We don't need the 730 if we're multiplying per front foot. So the per front foot is the more valuable, right? Not that you have that option normally. Usually it's zoned for this, and so you sell it for this. But you might, like my property. Right now, the city of Concord isn't allowing me to change the zoning. But if they weren't so much a stickler about keeping the industrial zoning, I could have a shot at probably changing it to residential if I chose to, and I'd have this kind of a consideration to keep in mind. Which one do I think it will be worth more, residentially or commercially or industrially? So it could happen. Okay, let's go back around and pick up where we detoured from. What about this one? When somebody dies without having a will, what is that called? Dying without a will. It's easy to mix up words, especially when none of them make any sense. Let me give you some answer choices and tell me in the chat. Let's see. Which one of these? Somebody dies without a will. Yeah, that's a good point, Marcus. He said it's involuntary alienation. That is true. But if it was just the choices I gave you, testate, intestate, escheat, or meets and bounds, best answer for dying without a will. And this is just brute strength memory, right? Just flashcards and pounding it in your brain. That one's called intestate. Intestate. When you die without a will, intestate. I was trying to think of a way to remember it, but I can't really think of one. All right, let's talk about this title assurance concept. That'll probably take us pretty close to the end of our time together. Title assurance. That just means that we have a buyer and a seller, and that buyer wants to make sure the title is good, that they're really going to be buying the title to the property with no problems, with no clouds, with no other person that can come and claim they are also the owner after they buy it. So we want to give that buyer assurance of good title, or title assurance. And that's going to involve examining the title. Who does the title examination? The attorney. That's one of the things the attorney does. The closing attorney is going to do a title search to verify through examining the chain of title that the title is good. They're going to assure the title is good by looking at the public records and following a chain of title and checking recording priority. Are there liens on it? Are there other owners? Can they discover any other owners besides the one who claims they're the only owner? So to provide that title assurance, there is a title search process. And it's kind of backwards. It goes from bottom to top here. The title search is something the closing attorney is doing during the under contract phase. So I'm the buyer agent. You want to buy a property. We write an offer. I present the offer. It gets accepted. Now we're under contract. Now, you as a buyer are going to want to hire some inspectors to go out there and see what the condition of the property is. The lender that you're borrowing the money from is going to want an appraiser to go out there and make sure it's worth what we think it is and what they're expected to loan the money on. How much their loan amount is depends upon the appraisal amount. And then in the meantime, the closing attorney, which you, the buyer, have chosen, we're going to send them the contract, and they're going to start searching the title, researching the title to see if the current owner, the current seller, is really the only seller, the only owner. And did they really buy it from the owner before them? And was there anybody else in the mix? And did they buy it from that seller? And did they buy it from that seller? And they go way back 30 years. They only have to go back 30 years. Because if they can go back just 30 years, as we'll see in a minute, that's called the Marketable Title Act. It only requires an attorney to do a title search for 30 years back. And any other kind of claims or clouds on the title older than 30 years ago, irrelevant. That'd probably be, got a question in the chat. Can the attorney and broker be the same person? That'd probably be a conflict of interest. That wouldn't be a good idea. You'd probably want to have two separate people there. Because for one thing, the attorney is hired by the buyer, right? So if anything, that attorney better be the buyer broker, but I don't even think it's probably a good idea for that. Certainly couldn't be the seller's broker because the attorney is mostly representing the buyer and the lender. So that attorney is doing a search, and they're going to use something called a grantor-grantee index. It's basically something they subscribe to. Like we brokers subscribe to the multiple listing service to see homes for sale, the attorney subscribes to the grantor-grantee index to do title searches. So they can see that, yes, this seller bought it from that seller who bought it from that seller, on and on and on, back 30 years. So that's the title search, verifying the chain of title, a clear chain of title. Yes, these are the only owners all along the way. Once they've checked it and checked for liens, the attorney is going to give an opinion. They're going to write up an opinion of title and say, this is a good title. It's clear. There's no problems here. Once they do that, that opinion they're going to give to the title insurance provider, the title insurance company, so that that title insurance policy can be written to cover the new buyer. And then that title insurance policy gets recorded and now it's official. So that's the search process and how that title insurance gets put on the property. The good news is it's only one time that you have to pay for it. This is not like a monthly fee to have title insurance. Like your homeowner's insurance would be a recurring fee, maybe annually. Not the same here. You one and done. Just pay the title insurance once. In some states, but not this state, not North Carolina, but some states, there's a thing they do called an abstract of title, which essentially means a super detailed chronological history. We don't require that. We don't do that here. Many states do, but not normally something we do in North Carolina. An abstract of title, not an issue here. We do a title search, but not to that same level of detail. And the purpose of that title insurance is to protect the lender and the buyer both from any sort of financial losses because of some sort of a defect in the title. Is there a problem? Did you miss the fact that someone else owns it? And now they were suing you because they are also an owner. They want some money. That's what they're trying to avoid. They want to make sure all of that's brought out into the open so that that's something that doesn't just keep on going on and on. So the phrase we could use here is title insurance is the best title assurance that it's all going to be good, that it's all clear, clean. Notice this thing at the top. It protects both parties, the lender and the buyer. Well, the buyer cares about the value of the property, right? Because they're going to own it. But the lender is only primarily concerned with how much they're loaning to the buyer. So if there's a title policy, title insurance policy, separate one from the lender versus the buyer's policy, how much do you think those policies are going to cover? If there's a title insurance policy for the owner, the buyer, and a separate one for the lender, do they need to both be for the sale price? Or can the lender's policy be only for the loan amount? Because that's all they care about. And it's B, right? That's the way it is. The lender is just concerned about what they're loaning. So their title policy only needs to cover the value for the loan amount that they're loaning. And then the other good news about that is every month when you make your mortgage payment, your loan amount is decreasing. So that lender's title policy is eventually going to go away completely. At least every month it goes down. So its coverage goes down as the loan amount goes down over time. And eventually when you pay off the mortgage completely, you don't even need that lender's policy in place because it's not even benefiting you, the owner, buyer. It was just there for the lender. And now they're gone because you paid them off in full. It might have taken you 30 years, but that's going to eventually happen. The red line here is the owner's title policy, and that sticks forever. That's just covering the value of the property as long as you own it, on and on and on. So at closing, the buyer pays both, and it's not that much. It's a few $100, but the owner pays for the owner's policy, the buyer. The buyer pays for their policy as the new owner, and they also pay for the lender's policy because that's a requirement by the lender. Lender says, if you want me to loan you all this money, you better provide a lender's title policy for us and pay for it yourself. So that's a one and done, one-time amount for each of those policies. And it protects the title. Okay. Another very testable item is this thing called the Connor Act. Connor Act. These are some important topics. There are certain documents that fall under the Connor Act. What the heck is the Connor Act? It says that certain documents need to be recorded at the courthouse, Register of Deeds office, in order to protect them against third-party people claiming ownership. So, in order for a document to be protected against third-party claims, it must be recorded. That is the Connor Act. So, what sorts of documents fall under this thing? What documents need to be recorded to protect against third-party claims? The acronym is DREAM Oil. Weird acronym. That's oil. I think that's actually olive oil, but DREAM Oil is the acronym. And here are the legal documents that need to be recorded to protect against third parties. Number 1, deeds. We already know that. Got to record the deed to protect that property against third parties so that the owner, the new buyer, can rest assured that they're the only owner. There's not some mystery person that'll pop up next week or next year. Deeds need to be recorded, be put on the public record. That's what recording does. If a seller sells some land, for instance, to a developer, they might sell them that 10 acres or 20 or 200 acres and say, yeah, I'll sell this to you. You can develop it, but I'm going to put some restrictive covenants in place. If people buy this land from you, developer, they have to do these things. Does that remind you of something? Sort of that fee simple to feasible thing. This is similar idea, but a different execution. A restrictive covenant is things like must be a 1-story only. No 2-story houses allowed in this development. Must have no more than a 6-foot tall fence. No 8-foot, 10-foot, 12-foot fences. Must be pretty vinyl of a certain level of quality, not like cheap, super cheap, temporary looking fences. Anything really. This is a private restriction. Restrictive covenants are private, meaning there's no government intervention to enforce them. If it's a private deed restriction, that means that how does it get enforced if you do violate it? You put up a 10-foot fence and you're not supposed to, only 6. Your neighbors would sue you for it if they wanted to. That's how that's enforced. You might get lucky and they may not want to go through the trouble, or they might be ticked off that they have the proper fence and you don't, so they're going to go ahead and sue you over it. But a restrictive covenant or a set of them for a given neighborhood needs to be recorded in order to protect against third-party claims under the Connor Act. We learned about easements, like a driveway easement, so that you can have your driveway across your neighbor's yard. That easement needs to be recorded. Any easements should be recorded. Assignments. What's an assignment? To assign something, to assign a contract, basically means I'm going to swap out for someone else. A contract assignment is the idea of like an investor. Anybody want to be an investor or already are? Have you seen the yellow signs at the corners, street corners with like will buy homes for cash, call the number? Those are called bandit signs. And those are investors, and they're looking for great deals. They want to find desperate sellers. They want to find sellers of property that's worth $350, but this seller is desperate, so they'll sell it to him for $200 or $250. And once they get them locked into a contract for pennies on the dollar, they won't even try to close on it themselves. They'll make quicker money with it and sell it to you, their investor buddy, and let you close on it and do something with it. And you pay them basically a bird dog fee or an assignment fee. It's not really a bird dog fee. That'd be illegal. An assignment fee. You're paying them a fee to swap out your name for theirs, for them to assign the contract over to you. That's allowed as long as the seller knows about it and the contract doesn't forbid it. But unfortunately, people have been a bit predatory with them before, and the buyer just wants to cash out and get a quick assignment fee and move on, and the person that they assign it to doesn't end up being able to close, and now the seller gets hurt. That's what's not allowed. Therefore, the seller needs to be told if it's assignable and keep that in mind before they choose to sell it, right? So if that's what's happening and you have an assignment, then you need to record that. A mortgage gets recorded. In North Carolina, that mortgage is called a deed of trust, but still, what you're accomplishing with this mortgage is pledging the property as security. You're saying, yep, if I don't pay, I don't stay. You can take it from me through foreclosure. This is collateral for this loan. That's what you're saying as a borrower to that lender you're borrowing it from. And so when you get that mortgage, when you have it and you sign it, it gets recorded. So two things get recorded from a typical purchase at closing: the deed and the deed of trust. The deed, which talks about the title, who's owning it, and the deed of trust, which talks about the fact that this property is going to be collateral for this loan. We already talked about an option to purchase. If you pay for an option to purchase so that you have amount of time to decide to buy later if you want to, that option needs to be recorded to protect you against third-party claims, especially then, because the whole point of the option is to have a leg up, right? An advantage over anybody else that might want to buy it. We saw installment land contract before. Same thing, seller financing. If you do seller financing with an installment land contract, record it so that you're protected. And then finally, the weird one. Leases, specifically leases for more than 3 years. Not 3 years or more than 3 years. The idea here is this, and it's more like in the commercial sector really, but if a lease is for 3 years or less, there are certain legal protections in place. For instance, if the landlord decides to sell the property and they have a lease, if it's a 3-year or less lease, that landlord sells the property to a new owner, that owner cannot kick out the tenant. They can't. They're protected. But if it's a lease for more than 3 years, they could, unless they record the lease. By recording the lease, it protects the tenant from being evicted just because a new owner takes over if it's for more than 3 years. That's all you need to know. Don't get into the why and how this works. Just know that. Under the Connor Act, leases for more than 3 years need to be recorded to protect against third-party claims. That's it. Leave it. Keep it light. Don't get too into the weeds on that one. And that's the Connor Act. It's pretty deep, but we need to know what that is. We know this already. If I were to say, Joseph, I'm going to sell you my property for $300,000. You're interested? And he says, sure, here's cash, $300,000. And I say, okay, here's a deed. Neil signing over to Joseph. I'm the only one that needs to sign the deed because I'm the grantor. I hand it to him. And he says, okay, great, thanks. And he heads off to the courthouse to the Register of Deeds. But he lives further away from the courthouse than Will does. And in the meantime, I sell that same property for that same price to Will. And he gives me $300,000. I sign a deed over to him fraudulently, right? I'm doing wrong here. And Will manages to get over to the courthouse before Joseph does. And Will manages to record it before Joseph does. And by the time Joseph gets there, the Register of Deeds lady says, this deed says that you're buying it from Neil, but the deed we have on file from 30 minutes ago says that the current owner is Will. So sorry, Joseph, I can't file this deed. Guess who wins? Will is the property owner because he got there first. Guess who loses? Me, because Joseph is going to kill me, right? He's going to track me down. I'm going to be in trouble, sure. But the point I'm making here is first to the courthouse to record is the winner, is the owner. It applies to liens. It also applies to deeds. That's the concept. The deed gets recorded first as the one who owns the property. And so why are we talking about recording this documents anyway? This dream oil list of documents. It tells the world that this document is in play, that you have this thing, this deed, this option, this assignment, this mortgage, whatever. You're putting it on the public record and saying, hey, world, I'm giving you constructive notice that this is a thing, right? The information is available. Here it is out there. Anybody's curious? You can look up all the deeds if you want to, right? Actual notice means information has been given. Constructive notice means information is available. You're establishing the priority. Who owns the property? Who gets paid first in the case of liens? And you're providing protection against third parties. This is mine because it's recorded in my name. Sorry, you tried to come in out of the woodwork 2 years later and claim you own it. Well, this is recorded under my name only. Sorry, you're out. Do you have proof in writing? No, they just handshook. We just shook hands one time. Okay, take me to court. Go ahead. You're not really going to get anywhere, right? The recording protects the one who gets it recorded. Where do we go? We talked about it already. The Register of Deeds office in the county where the property is. And don't forget, even if you don't record the deed is still considered valid because a recording is not an essential element of a deed. It doesn't affect whether it's valid or not. It needs to be recorded because of the Connor Act, but not to make it valid. It's still going to be valid regardless of the recording. But then there's that little caveat there at the bottom that might make it confusing. It's not the thing that makes it valid or not is the reason it should be recorded. In North Carolina, recording it is the thing that makes it considered, so you can consider it closed. Now it's done. It's official. Now the seller can get their proceeds. The agents can get their commission. The buyer can get the keys. We mentioned this a second ago. When the attorney is doing that title search, all they need to do is search back 30 years. This might be a 100-year-old property, but all they have to do is search back 30, and anything beyond 30 that affects the title, irrelevant. So what are they looking for within these most recent 30 years? Any sort of liens, defects, questions of law or fact, purchaser being exposed to litigation, a threat to quiet enjoyment, some other person coming in and claiming ownership. But the marketable, write this one down, the Marketable Title Act extinguishes clouds prior to 30 years back. These things are not recorded. We know through Dream Oil what is recorded, but when you have a contract to buy it, that doesn't get recorded. That's just between the parties. We don't need to record that. We'll learn more about promissory notes when we get to the financing section. But when you borrow money to buy property, you sign two documents among many. One of them is the mortgage or deed of trust, pledging the property as collateral. The other is the promissory note, basically saying, here are the terms of the loan. I'm borrowing this amount of money for this many months or years at this interest rate. That's the promissory note, and I promise to pay it back. It's a two-document kind of a deal. But that promissory note does not need to be recorded, while the mortgage does. The deed of trust gets recorded, the promissory note does not. And then when we get hired to help someone sell or buy, we sign an agency agreement with them. It's them as the client in our firm and us on behalf of our firm. We sign these agency agreements to spell out the fact that we're going to take care of that client. Those agency agreements also do not have to be in writing. I'm sorry, they do need to be in writing. They don't need to be recorded. Let's sum up with 3 pop quiz questions and we'll be done. What are the 2 methods of deed transfer? Hint, happy and sad. Beautiful. Perfect. Voluntary and involuntary. Good job. Why would a buyer be well advised to obtain title insurance? Might be a little bit of a thinker. I mentioned it. Provides assurance. That's a good one. Because what could possibly happen after you buy it and that seller's tracked down? because you need them to stand behind it like they promised to, but they're dead or they're broke and they can't afford it. The title insurance policy will pay for it. It'll cover it in the event that that happens, right? The grantor might not have money to reimburse you for those losses. So therefore, the title insurance policy would. And then if multiple titles or deeds exist, how does the court decide who wins? Who's the one that can have actually has a claim to the property? There you go. You got it, guys. Beautiful. We knocked it out of the park. We finished another chapter 2 tonight, actually. And that means that we'll hit chapter 5. What is today? Okay. That's next week. Chapter 5 on Wednesday. Keep on marching down through the list. Put your name in the chat for me, please. And I'll see you next week. Have a great weekend. The Marketable Title Act means that when the attorney does his title search, here, I'll share it. They only have to go back. There it is. They only have to go back 30 years when they do their title search. Any sort of cloud on the title that happened before the 30 years is irrelevant. It's extinguished. It doesn't affect the title at all. You're welcome. You too. We good, Catherine? Okay, good.